before a single idea enters this room, let's do something small together. Notice the weight of your shoulders against whatever is holding them right now. A chair, a pillow, the seat of a car still ticking as it cools. Not to fix that weight, not to sit up straighter because some old voice told you posture was a moral question. Just notice it, the way a door notices its hinge, quietly, without needing to comment on the noticing. Notice the temperature of the air on your skin. Notice the particular hush of wherever you are right now. The hum of a refrigerator 2 rooms away, the distant sound of a car passing, or the simple, complete silence of a house at an hour when most of the world has gone quiet. You aren't here to learn something tonight. You are here to land, the way a ship lowers its anchor, not because the sea was wrong, but because even the longest voyage needs a harbor to rest in before it can go on. So let this be the harbor. Let your breath come and go without your supervision. It has been doing this since before you had opinions about anything at all, and it does not require your management now. I want to tell you, gently, why you're here. The title that brought you into this room is not a subtle one. Grow or stay comfortable forever. It sounds, on the surface, like a challenge, almost like an accusation. I want to promise you, right at the start, that it is not. It is something closer to what it actually was in the hands of the man we're going to spend this evening with. A private warning, written not to shame anyone, but to wake one particular, tired, overburdened person gently back up to their own life. That person was Marcus Aurelius, and the warning was never meant for an audience. It was meant for himself. I want to offer you a permission before we go any further, because a title like tonight's can easily be misheard as a threat. Grow, or you have failed. Grow, or you are wasting your one life. Grow, or you deserve whatever stagnation finds you. That is not what we're doing here. That framework belongs to a much harsher, much louder conversation than the one this hour is interested in having. Here is the truth beneath the warning, and I want you to hold it gently, rather than urgently. Your desire for comfort is not a flaw in your character. It is one of the oldest, most trustworthy instincts a living creature carries. Every organism that has ever survived a difficult season did so in part because something in it reached for warmth, for safety, for the path of least resistance, when the alternative threatened its continued existence. You did not invent this instinct. You inherited it, the way you inherited your heartbeat, from a lineage of creatures who quite literally would not exist, and therefore neither would you, if comfort-seeking hadn't kept enough of them alive, long enough to pass the instinct forward. So when I say Marcus Aurelius left behind a warning about comfort, I do not mean he believed comfort was corruption, or that rest was laziness, or that a person owes the world constant restless striving in order to justify their place in it. That was not his philosophy, and it will not be the philosophy of this hour either. What he actually warned against was something quieter, and in some ways far more dangerous, precisely because it disguises itself so well. Not comfort itself, but comfort mistaken for a permanent home. Comfort as a walled garden you enter for an afternoon and never leave again, not because the garden asked you to stay forever, but because leaving, at some point, simply stopped feeling possible. This is the warning we're going to sit with tonight. Not a demand that you abandon rest, abandon safety, abandon the parts of your life that currently feel settled and good. An invitation, instead, to notice, gently, without shame, where settled has quietly become sealed, where a garden you once needed for healing has become a wall you've forgotten was ever meant to have a gate. If some part of you feels a flicker of guilt right now, a sense that you already know, somewhere, which parts of your life have gone still for longer than you meant them to. I want to meet that feeling directly, before it has the chance to curdle into shame. That stillness is not a moral failure. I want to offer you a different way of picturing it. Think of a harbor in winter, boats resting at anchor, sails furled, decks quiet under a layer of frost. If you didn't know better, you might look at that harbor and think nothing was happening there at all, that the boats had simply stopped, that their purpose had quietly expired somewhere along the way. But a harbor in winter is not a harbor that has failed. It is a harbor doing exactly what harbors are built to do in a season that calls for shelter rather than voyage. The boats are not broken. They are waiting, hulls sound, ropes secure, for the particular kind of weather that makes sailing worthwhile again. Your own stillness may be exactly this, not evidence of a broken will, not proof that you've become lazy or unambitious or lost some essential spark you once had. It may simply be a season of shelter, entered honestly, for reasons that made complete sense at the time. Exhaustion that needed tending, a loss that needed grieving, a body or a heart that needed rest before it could be asked to voyage anywhere again. The danger Marcus Aurelius wrote about, quietly, privately, in the pages of a journal he never intended the world to read, was not the shelter itself. It was the specific danger of a harbor that forgets it was ever meant to let a boat sail back out. Tonight, we are not going to shame you for the season of shelter you've been in. We are going to ask, gently, together, whether the season might be ready to turn. And if it is, what the very first, smallest movement back toward open water might actually look like, without requiring you to abandon the harbor's safety all at once. I think it's worth pausing here, before we go further, to meet the man properly. Not the marble statue version of him, not the stern emperor carved in stone astride a horse, but the person who actually held the pen that wrote the words we'll spend tonight with. Marcus Aurelius was born into a wealthy Roman family in the year 121, and was, by most historical accounts, a serious, thoughtful child who took to philosophy with unusual intensity from a young age. So much so that as a boy, he reportedly insisted on sleeping on the ground and wearing rough clothing, practicing a kind of voluntary discomfort simply because it interested him philosophically, long before he had any inkling of the power that would eventually be placed in his hands. He did not seek the throne. This matters enormously to everything we'll discuss tonight, so I want to say it plainly. Marcus Aurelius became emperor of Rome, not through ambition, not through scheming for power, but through a long, unusual chain of adoption, arranged by the Emperor Hadrian, who selected a successor, who in turn selected Marcus as his own eventual heir. By the time the purple robe actually settled onto his shoulders in the year 161, Marcus was, by his own private writing, deeply reluctant about the whole affair, a man who would have been, in his own words, considerably happier with a quiet life of study than with the endless, grinding weight of ruling an empire. And what a weight it turned out to be. Marcus's reign was defined almost entirely by crisis. Barely had he taken the throne when war broke out on Rome's eastern frontier. Soon after, a devastating plague, likely smallpox, carried home by returning soldiers, swept through the empire, killing, by some estimates, millions of people over the following years, including members of Marcus's own household. Floods struck Rome itself. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern borders in a series of exhausting, years-long campaigns that Marcus, despite having no military ambition or particular taste for war, was forced to personally oversee. often from freezing military camps, far from the comforts of the capital. It was in one of these camps, cold, exhausted, grieving, surrounded by the ordinary miseries of a long campaign, that Marcus wrote the book we know today as Meditations. And here is the detail I want you to sit with tonight, because I think it changes everything about how we're able to receive his words. He was not writing a philosophy book for readers. He kept no plans to publish it. He was writing, each night, in a private journal, addressed entirely to himself, using these pages the way you or I might use a quiet hour like this one, as a place to remind himself, again and again, of what actually mattered, because the daily grind of his life made it so easy to forget. This is why his warning about comfort carries the particular weight it does. It was not delivered from a lecture hall at a comfortable distance from struggle. It was written by a man who held more comfort within reach than nearly anyone alive in his era, the entire wealth and luxury of the Roman Empire available to him with a single word, and who kept, night after night, reminding himself not to reach for it, not because comfort was evil, but because he understood something we are going to spend the rest of this hour exploring together, that a life spent reaching only for comfort, however available that comfort might be, is a life that slowly, quietly, forgets what it was ever for. I want to offer you an image tonight, one that Marcus Aurelius himself returned to often in his private writing, though he described it in slightly different terms across the years of his journal. He wrote about the mind as a kind of fortress, a citadel, secure against the disturbances of the outer world, a place a person could retreat to at any moment, regardless of the chaos surrounding them, and find something steady, something untouched, something entirely their own. I want you to picture this citadel for a moment, because it's going to serve as our companion image for the rest of tonight. The way the hallway served us in an earlier conversation and might, if you've spent time in that clearing before, still live somewhere in your memory. Picture stone walls, thick and old, built up over years, maybe decades. Somewhere inside those walls is a courtyard, the settled, familiar rooms of your daily life, the routines you know by heart, the relationships that ask nothing new of you, the version of yourself you've grown so used to being that you rarely think to question its shape anymore. This citadel is not a bad place. I want to be honest about that from the very beginning. A citadel like this one is often built for excellent reasons: to keep out something that once hurt you, to hold something safe that once felt fragile, to give a tired, overburdened self somewhere reliable to rest. But here's the part of the image that matters most for tonight's conversation. A citadel, by its very design, has walls. And walls, whatever else they do, also do one particular thing whether we intend it or not. They decide, silently, what gets to come in, and, this is the part we so rarely examine, what gets to go back out. Marcus Aurelius understood the citadel of the mind as a place of genuine strength, a place from which a person could meet any external hardship without being shattered by it. But I want to add something to his image tonight, something drawn less from his explicit words and more from what his own life, examined honestly, seems to teach us. A citadel that only ever receives and never sends anything back out into the world stops being a fortress and starts becoming something closer to a very comfortable tomb. This is not a condemnation. It is simply an honest description of what happens to any structure, however beautifully built, if its gate is never opened again. The courtyard stays tidy, the walls stay strong, and slowly, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the person inside stops remembering that a wider world exists at all beyond what those walls currently contain. Tonight, we are not going to tear the citadel down. You built it for reasons that deserve respect, not demolition. We are simply going to walk together toward the gate, the one you may have stopped noticing, the one that has likely grown quiet with disuse, and ask gently whether it might be time to open it, even just a little, even just for an afternoon. I want to slow down here and offer a distinction that I think matters enormously, because without it, everything else tonight risks collapsing into the exact kind of harsh, hustle-driven message this space has never been interested in delivering. There is a profound difference between shelter and ceiling, and learning to tell them apart is, in many ways, the entire heart of tonight's warning. Shelter is chosen consciously, and it remains porous. It has doors that still open, windows that still let in light and air, and the occasional visitor, a clear sense that its walls exist to protect something precious, rather than to prevent anything from ever changing again. A person resting in genuine shelter knows, somewhere in themselves, that the shelter is temporary, or at least that it remains theirs to leave whenever the season calls for it. Sealing happens more quietly, almost always without a single decisive moment we could point back to and say, "There, that's when it happened." It happens through years of small, reasonable-sounding postponements. Not this year, not while things are still so unsettled, not until I feel more ready. Each postponement taken alone sounds entirely sensible, even wise. But taken together, across enough years, they don't add up to patience. They add up to a gate that has rusted shut from disuse, a citadel that has quietly become a permanent residence, rather than the temporary shelter it was originally built to be. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in that cold military camp, was not warning against shelter. He took shelter constantly, in philosophy, in his private writing, in the discipline of his own attention, which he treated as a genuine refuge from the chaos surrounding him, on every side. What he warned against, again and again, in different words across different pages of his journal, was the specific danger of a mind that uses its citadel as an excuse to stop engaging with the actual, difficult, uncertain work of living a life aligned with what it claims to value. I want you to ask yourself something tonight, gently, without needing an immediate answer. Somewhere in your own life, is there a citadel that has quietly become a seal, a comfort that started as genuine shelter and has, somewhere along the way, without your full awareness, become the entire boundary of what you now consider possible for yourself? You don't need to answer that tonight. You only need to let the question exist, the way a seed exists in soil long before anything visible happens above the surface. I want to tell you something now that I think reveals more powerfully than any single passage from his writing could exactly why Marcus Aurelius's warning about comfort carries the weight it does. Something drawn not from his philosophy, but from the actual documented history of what happened after he was gone. Marcus Aurelius had a son named Commodus, and Commodus, by nearly every historical account we have, grew up inside the most comfortable citadel the ancient world had to offer. Every luxury of the Roman Empire available to him from birth, every want anticipated before he had to voice it, every difficulty smoothed over by an apparatus of servants, tutors, and imperial machinery, built specifically to ensure he would never have to face the kind of hardship that had shaped his father's own philosophy so profoundly. When Marcus died in the year 180, breaking with the long-standing Roman tradition of selecting the most capable available successor through adoption, the very tradition that had placed Marcus himself on the throne. He passed the empire directly to his biological son. Commodus was 19 years old. What followed, according to the historical record, was one of the most striking illustrations imaginable of exactly the warning we're exploring tonight. Commodus, by most contemporary and later accounts, showed little interest in the burdens of governance that had defined his father's entire adult life. He preferred, instead, the pleasures readily available to him: extravagant spectacle, personal indulgence, a growing detachment from the actual, difficult work of ruling that Marcus had approached night after night in that cold military tent as a kind of sacred duty rather than a privilege to be enjoyed. His reign, by the consistent judgment of Roman historians writing in the years that followed, marked a sharp and troubling departure from the disciplined, dutiful example his father had spent a lifetime trying to embody, and it ended in the year 192 in his assassination amid growing instability that many historians trace directly back to the chaos of his rule. I do not share this story to condemn a young man who, by all evidence, was shaped as much by his extraordinary circumstances as any of us are shaped by ours, nor to suggest that a difficult childhood automatically produces a difficult adult, or that an easy one automatically produces a complacent one. Life is rarely so simple, and I don't want to flatten a complicated history into a tidy moral fable. But I do want to sit, honestly, with the striking historical irony here, because I think it illuminates something Marcus himself seemed to sense, even if he could never have predicted its exact outcome. Here was a man who wrote, night after night, in the coldest and most difficult circumstances of his life, about the danger of comfort mistaken for a destination. And here, following directly after him, was a life shaped by nearly unlimited access to exactly that comfort, with consequences that Roman history would remember, by nearly every surviving account, as a cautionary tale rather than a triumph. I think Marcus, more than almost anyone in his position could have, understood something crucial: that comfort, unchecked and unexamined, does not merely fail to build character. It can actively erode whatever character was there to begin with, not through any single dramatic collapse, but through the slow, cumulative absence of the very friction that character requires in order to keep developing at all. This is the warning at the very center of tonight's conversation, illustrated not through abstract philosophy, but through the actual, lived, historically documented arc of one father's discipline and one son's very different path. Let's come back now to the ordinary texture of an actual life. Your life, this week, this month, because the pull toward permanent comfort rarely announces itself dramatically. It moves in small, reasonable-sounding decisions, the kind that never feel, in any single moment, like a choice to stay sealed inside the citadel forever. I want to walk through several of these quiet grounds with you now, gently, the way we'd walk through a garden, noting which paths have gone unused, simply because no one told them otherwise. The first ground is someday thinking. Notice, over the coming days, how often a genuine desire in you gets filed away under a word like someday, once things settle down, when the timing is better. Someday is a remarkably comfortable word because it allows you to keep the desire alive in your imagination. You still get to think of yourself as someone who wants this, without ever actually risking the discomfort of attempting it. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, again and again, about the shortness of life, specifically to interrupt this exact pattern, because he understood that someday left unexamined, has a habit of quietly consuming an entire life, one comfortable postponement at a time. The second ground is cynicism worn as protection. There is a particular kind of world weariness that can feel, from the inside, like wisdom, a settled certainty that most efforts don't pay off, that most people disappoint, that expecting little protects you from the pain of expecting too much. I want to be careful here, because genuine discernment, the ability to see situations clearly, rather than through rose-colored optimism, is a real and valuable quality. But cynicism, the specific flavor that arrives before genuine assessment has even had a chance to happen, is often something else entirely. A wall built to keep disappointment out, which, as an unavoidable side effect, also keeps growth out, because growth nearly always requires a willingness to hope for something you cannot yet guarantee. The third ground is busyness that never quite touches the thing that matters. This is a subtle one, because it can look, from the outside and even from the inside, exactly like effort, a full calendar, a long list of tasks completed. And yet, if you look closely, so much of this motion can circle carefully around the one genuinely uncertain, genuinely important thing a person has been avoiding. The difficult conversation, the creative work that might not turn out well, the relationship that needs honest attention rather than another distraction. Marcus, writing from a military camp surrounded by genuine, unavoidable demands, still found himself needing to remind himself, repeatedly, to focus on what actually mattered, rather than the countless lesser tasks that could fill every available hour without ever touching the center of a well-lived life. The fourth ground is the comfort of a familiar identity, even an unhappy one. There is a strange, often unspoken comfort in staying exactly who you've always been, even when who you've always been no longer serves you. The reliable one, the cautious one, the one who doesn't take risks. Changing this identity, even towards something better, requires a kind of discomfort that has nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with the disorientation of no longer knowing exactly who you are for a while. Many people, without ever consciously choosing it, decide that this particular discomfort is simply not worth the trouble, and so they stay inside a familiar identity long after it has stopped fitting the life they actually want to live. The fifth ground is perfectionism, used as a permanent excuse not to begin. If a thing must be done flawlessly or not at all, it becomes remarkably easy never to do it, while still feeling, privately, like a person who cares deeply about doing things well. This is one of comfort's most sophisticated disguises, because it wears the costume of high standards, while quietly functioning as permanent protection from the vulnerability of an honest, imperfect attempt. The sixth ground is comparison that talks you out of starting before you've even tried. Watching someone further along a path you'd like to walk can either open something in you or close it, depending entirely on how you receive it. When it closes, when the natural response is they're already so far ahead, what's the point of my starting now? Comfort has found a remarkably efficient way to keep you exactly where you are, disguised as simple realism about your chances. I want to pause here, the way we did in an earlier conversation, and offer you the same gentle reassurance. None of these grounds develop by accident, and none of them make you weak or lazy or lacking in ambition. Every single one of them formed for a reason that made sense at the time, protecting you from a disappointment you'd already tasted once, or a failure of a kind you weren't ready to risk again. We are not here to condemn the part of you that built these patterns. We are here, simply, to notice them, gently, standing at the gate of the citadel, wondering together whether it might finally be time to open it, just a little, just to see what's still out there. Let's pause here for a moment. We've covered a fair amount of ground, and I don't want you carrying all of it forward with tension, gathering in your chest, cataloging which of these patterns belongs to you. So let's set that down, just for a little while. Picture that harbor again, the one from the very start of this hour. Boats at anchor, water calm, the particular hush of a place, built for both rest and departure. You are standing at the end of the dock, and you don't need to decide anything right now. You don't need to choose, in this exact moment, whether it's time to sail or time to stay another season. Watch the water instead. Notice how it moves, without needing your permission. The small, unhurried rhythm of waves against the hulls of boats that are, each of them, exactly where they need to be for right now. Nothing here is urgent. Nothing here requires an answer before we continue. Let your breath match that rhythm if it wants to. In, like a wave arriving. Out, like a wave withdrawing. Patient, unbothered, certain of its own return. You are the dock, steady beneath it all, not the water, not required to move, simply because movement is happening around you. When you're ready, no rush at all. We'll walk a little further together. I want to introduce now one of the ideas Marcus Aurelius returned to, more often than perhaps any other, across the pages of his private journal. An idea that can sound, at first mention, unbearably heavy, even morbid, but which I want to offer you tonight in an entirely different light. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. I understand why this phrase can land uncomfortably, especially in a conversation that has spent this much time offering gentleness, offering permission, offering a soft landing, rather than a harsh confrontation. I want to be very clear. This is not going to become a lecture about wasted time, delivered with guilt or urgency. Marcus did not write about death to frighten himself into productivity, a word this conversation has no interest in using. He wrote about it because he had discovered something quieter, something closer to relief than to dread, hidden inside the honest acknowledgement of his own mortality. Here is the relief, if you're willing to receive it. The awareness of death, held gently rather than anxiously, has a remarkable way of dissolving false urgency around the wrong things, while clarifying real urgency around the right ones. Most of what keeps a person sealed inside their citadel, the fear of judgment, the fear of failure, the fear of what other people might think of an imperfect attempt, shrinks considerably when measured against the plain, undeniable fact that none of us has an unlimited number of seasons in that harbor. And most of what actually matters, an honest conversation, a risk taken in the name of something you love, a gate finally opened after years of disuse, grows correspondingly larger, more urgent in the truest, least anxious sense of that word. Once you stop pretending, you have infinite time to get around to it. Marcus wrote to himself, repeatedly, some version of a simple reminder that he could leave this life at any moment, and that this fact should shape, not his fear, but his actions, what he chose to do, how honestly he chose to speak, how fully he chose to show up for each ordinary day, rather than treating it as a mere rehearsal for some more important day still to come. I want to offer you a gentler translation of this same idea, one that fits the spirit of tonight's conversation, rather than a soldier's cold camp. Memento mori is not a threat. It is closer to a permission slip. Permission to stop waiting for the perfect, fully comfortable conditions before you finally walk through the gate. Because those conditions, examined honestly, were never actually coming. There will never be a version of your life with zero risk, zero uncertainty, zero possibility of an outcome you didn't want. Death, held gently in the corner of your awareness rather than pushed away entirely, simply reminds you that the citadel was never meant to be a place you die inside of, safe and untested, having never once found out what you were actually capable of beyond its walls. There is a phrase closely associated with Marcus Aurelius and the broader Stoic tradition he belonged to that has become widely known in recent years, sometimes quoted so often it risks losing its weight through repetition. I want to slow it back down tonight and give it the fuller attention it deserves. The idea that what stands in the way becomes the way forward. Marcus wrote about this in the context of obstacles quite directly. The notion that an impediment to action can, when met rightly, actually advance the action rather than prevent it, because the very act of working around, through, or with an obstacle often produces a stronger, more capable version of the effort than would have existed if the path had simply been clear from the start. I want to connect this directly to tonight's central image because I think it clarifies something important about the citadel and its gate. So much of what keeps us sealed inside comfort is a quiet, often unexamined belief that growth should feel smooth, that if a path requires real effort, real discomfort, real uncertainty, something must be wrong with either the path or with us for finding it so difficult. This belief, gentle as it sounds, is quietly devastating because it treats the very friction that produces growth as evidence that growth isn't meant for us after all. Think of a young tree growing in open ground, exposed to regular wind. That wind is not the tree's enemy, however much resistance it creates against each branch. The wind is, in fact, essential to the tree's development. The mechanical stress it creates forces the tree to develop stronger, more extensive root systems and thicker, more resilient trunk fiber than a tree grown in a perfectly sheltered greenhouse, protected from all resistance, ever develops on its own. A tree raised entirely without wind often grows tall quickly, but with alarmingly shallow roots. Beautiful until the first real storm arrives, at which point it topples. In circumstances a wind-tested tree would have simply weathered. This is what Marcus understood about obstacles, and it's what I want to offer you tonight as a gentler way of relating to the discomfort that has likely kept you inside your own citadel for longer than you intended. The obstacle in front of you, the hard conversation, the uncertain creative attempt, the vulnerable first step towards something you actually want, is not evidence that you've chosen the wrong path. It may, in fact, be the very wind your own roots have been quietly needing all this time in order to grow strong enough to hold you through whatever storm eventually finds you, regardless of how carefully you tried to stay sheltered from it. I want to draw out a distinction now that I think is the single most important nuance in tonight's entire conversation, because without it, everything we've discussed risks collapsing into exactly the kind of restless, never satisfied striving that Stoic philosophy actually stood firmly against. Marcus Aurelius and the broader Stoic tradition he inherited from thinkers like Epictetus and Zeno before him placed enormous value on a state of inner peace, what the Greeks called ataraxia, an untroubled tranquility of mind that remained steady regardless of external circumstance. This was not a minor detail of Stoic philosophy. It was, in many respects, the entire point. The Stoics were not advocates of restless, anxious striving. They were, if anything, some of history's most articulate defenders of genuine peace. So how do we reconcile this with tonight's warning against comfort? The answer lies in a distinction that's easy to name and genuinely difficult to feel your way toward in an actual life. The difference between contentment and complacency. Contentment is alive. It is a settled peace that remains responsive to what's actually happening, capable of recognizing when something genuinely calls for change and meeting that call honestly, without anxiety, without unnecessary striving, but also without denial. A person resting in real contentment can still notice clearly when their gate needs opening and can walk toward that opening calmly, without the frantic energy of someone convinced they're falling behind. Complacency wears the same outward appearance as contentment, the same calm face, the same absence of visible struggle, but underneath, it is not alive in the same way. It is instead a kind of numbness mistaken for peace, a refusal to look honestly at what might need to change, maintained not through genuine equanimity, but through careful avoidance of anything that might disturb the current arrangement. Complacency does not respond to what's actually happening. It filters out whatever might require a response. The test I want to offer you tonight, the one that can help you tell these two states apart in your own life, is this. Genuine contentment can look directly at an uncomfortable truth without flinching and remain calm. Complacency needs to look away in order to remain calm at all. If some part of your current peace depends on not examining certain questions too closely, the friendship that's grown hollow, the work that no longer aligns with what you actually value, the dream you've quietly stopped mentioning even to yourself, that peace may be complacency wearing contentment's clothing. I want to be gentle here, because I know this distinction can feel like it's taking something away from you, right when you most needed permission to rest. It isn't. You are still allowed rest. You are still allowed genuine, unhurried peace, exactly as much as you need. The only thing being asked of you is honesty about which kind of peace you're currently resting in. The kind that remains open to truth, or the kind that has quietly agreed with itself never to look too closely at certain locked rooms of its own citadel. Let's rest here for a moment before we build something practical together. Picture a watchtower at the edge of the citadel we've been imagining all evening. Not a place of alarm, not a place of constant vigilance and worry, but simply a quiet, elevated spot where a person can see a little further than they can from the courtyard below. Imagine climbing its narrow stairs slowly, unhurried, feeling the air grow slightly cooler, slightly clearer, with each step upward. From the top, notice how the view widens. You can still see the courtyard, familiar and steady below you. But you can also see now the fields beyond the walls, not as threats, not as demands, just as territory that exists, patiently, waiting for whatever season you eventually decide to walk into it. There is nothing to do up here except look. No decision required. No plan to draft on the spot. Just the wide, quiet permission of altitude. The simple fact that your life contains more territory than the courtyard alone, whether or not you choose to walk any further into it today. Breathe here for a few moments, taking in this wider view. When you're ready, we'll walk back down together and build something practical to carry with you. I promised you, at the start of this hour, that we wouldn't leave you with reflection alone, that we'd build something small and structured to carry forward, something you can return to without needing a library of philosophy or a decade of study behind you. So let's build that now. I want to call this the gate practice, because it takes its shape directly from the image we've been walking with all evening, the citadel and the gate that has perhaps gone quiet with disuse. Like every practice offered in this space, it requires no dramatic physical effort, no harsh discipline in the gritted teeth sense of that word. It asks only for your honest attention, offered gently, 4 small movements at a time. The first movement is feel. When you notice yourself reaching for comfort in a moment that seems to be asking for something else, avoiding a conversation, closing a tab instead of starting the work, saying someday instead of naming a real date, pause just for a breath and feel what's actually happening in your body rather than immediately explaining it away or judging it. Notice the specific texture of the pull toward staying still. This alone interrupts so much of comfort's quiet power, because so much of what keeps us sealed inside the citadel is precisely the habit of skipping past the raw feeling and rushing straight into justification. The second movement is name. Once you've felt it, give it an honest name, privately, without performance. Not a harsh judgment, not I'm being lazy, I'm being weak. Simply a plain, accurate description. This is fear of an uncertain outcome. This is the comfort of staying who I've always been. This is genuine tiredness that deserves rest, not more pushing. Naming translates the pull out of the vague, wordless territory, where it holds the most power, and into a form your conscious mind can actually examine honestly. The third movement is breathe. Take 1 slow breath, not to force yourself into action, not to talk yourself out of the comfort you're feeling, but simply to signal to yourself that you're staying present with this moment, rather than fleeing it in either direction, toward reckless action or toward numb avoidance. This single breath is a small, quiet act of self-respect, proof that you're capable of standing at the gate, honestly, without needing to immediately slam it shut or throw it open before you're ready. The fourth movement is choose. Only now, having felt, named, and breathed, do you make a conscious choice about what happens next. Sometimes the honest choice will be to stay in the courtyard a while longer, genuinely, consciously, not through avoidance, but through real discernment that this particular season calls for more shelter before more voyage. Sometimes the choice will be a single small step toward the gate, the first sentence of the hard conversation, the first 10 minutes of the uncertain work, the first honest word spoken, instead of the comfortable silence you might have chosen a year ago. The goal of this movement is not that you always choose growth. It's that the choice is made by you, consciously, rather than being made on your behalf by a comfort so habitual, it no longer feels like a choice at all. Whenever the pull toward permanent shelter returns, and it will return, often, because this is not a practice with a finish line, take out your gate, feel what's there, name it plainly, breathe once to stay present, and choose gently what the next small movement will be. This is soft duty, not harsh discipline. It asks for a few seconds of honest attention, repeated patiently, growing stronger, not through force, but through the same quiet, cumulative practice that eventually wears a clear path through even the most overgrown field. Part 9, the 3 quiet arts. I want to introduce now a framework that scholars of Marcus Aurelius's work have identified running through nearly every page of his private journal, even though he never named it quite this explicitly himself. Modern interpreters of his writing, most notably the French scholar Pierre Hadot, have described this framework as 3 interconnected disciplines. I want to offer it to you tonight in softer language as 3 quiet arts, because I think that framing serves the spirit of what Marcus was actually reaching for far better than the harder word ever could. The first art is the art of perception. This is the practice of seeing things exactly as they are, stripped of the extra layers of judgment, exaggeration, and story we so often add without noticing. Marcus wrote often about separating an event itself from our opinion about that event, noticing, for instance, that a difficult conversation is simply a difficult conversation, not automatically a catastrophe, not automatically evidence of your own inadequacy, not automatically a sign that everything is falling apart. So much of what keeps a person sealed inside their citadel is not the actual difficulty of the world beyond its walls, but the exaggerated, catastrophized story about that difficulty that gets told before any real encounter with it has even begun. The art of perception asks you to notice that story gently and to set it down long enough to see what's actually, plainly, there. The second art is the art of action. This is the practice of acting in accordance with what you actually value, not perfectly, not without hesitation, but honestly, in alignment with the kind of person you're trying to become, rather than the kind of person old habit or old fear would prefer you remain. Marcus placed enormous emphasis on this art because he understood something crucial. Perception alone changes nothing. A person can see the gate clearly, understand exactly why it needs opening, and still remain inside the courtyard indefinitely if the art of action never gets practiced alongside the art of seeing. Right action, for Marcus, was never about producing some impressive external outcome. It was about the alignment itself, the simple, private decency of acting in a way that matched what you actually believed mattered, regardless of whether anyone else would ever know or approve. The third art is the art of will. This is perhaps the subtlest of the three, and the one most directly connected to tonight's central theme. The art of will is the practice of accepting, calmly, what lies genuinely outside your control, while directing your full attention and care toward what remains genuinely yours to shape. Marcus wrote about this distinction constantly because he understood it as the foundation of both peace and growth simultaneously. You cannot control whether a risk succeeds, whether another person receives your honesty well, whether the world responds kindly to your first uncertain attempt at something new. But you can, entirely, control whether you make the attempt at all, whether you speak with honesty, whether you walk toward the gate with your full, considered will, rather than being dragged toward the courtyard's comfortable center by habits you never consciously chose. These three arts, practiced together, offer a far gentler path toward growth than the harsh, forceful self-improvement our culture usually prescribes. See clearly, act in alignment, release your grip on outcomes you were never meant to control in the first place. This is not a program to master by next month. It is, like everything else tonight, a practice to return to, gently, for as long as living continues to ask it of you. I want to offer you something now that I think is one of the most quietly radical ideas in all of Marcus Aurelius's private writing, something that stands in direct, gentle opposition to the way most of us have been taught to think about a meaningful life. We tend to imagine meaning as something accumulated over a long stretch of time, a career built across decades, a legacy assembled piece by piece, a life whose worth can only be properly assessed once it's finished and laid out end to end for evaluation. Marcus, writing each night in that military camp, with no guarantee he would see another season, arrived at a very different understanding. He returned again and again to the idea that a single day, lived fully and in alignment with what actually matters, contains within it the same complete measure of a well-lived life as an entire decade does. Not a smaller version, not a rough draft awaiting a longer, more finished performance later. complete in itself, exactly as it is. I want to sit with this for a moment because I think it offers real relief to anyone who has ever felt paralyzed by the sheer size of the growth they imagine standing before them, the entire life they'd need to rebuild, the years of accumulated comfort they'd need to somehow undo all at once. That paralysis, understandable as it is, rests on a hidden assumption Marcus would have gently challenged. The assumption that growth requires a grand, sweeping transformation of your whole life before it counts as real. It doesn't. This day, today, whatever day happens to hold you as you listen to this, is enough. Not enough in some diminished consolation prize sense, but enough in the fullest, most complete sense that word can carry. One honest conversation held today is not a small fraction of the growth you eventually hope to embody. It is the growth itself, complete, whole, requiring nothing further to justify its worth. One small step through the gate, taken today, does not need tomorrow's step to validate it. It stands entirely on its own. This reframing matters enormously for how sustainable this work actually becomes. A person waiting to transform their entire life, all at once, will likely wait indefinitely, because that scale of change rarely arrives in a single, tidy motion. But a person who understands that today, this ordinary Tuesday, this unremarkable evening, already contains everything necessary for a complete, aligned, well-lived day, that person can begin now, without waiting for conditions that were never actually going to arrive in the grand, all-at-once form their imagination had been quietly demanding. Let's pause once more before we continue. Picture a field at dawn, mist still resting low over the grass, the first pale light just beginning to touch the tops of the trees at its edge. Nothing in this field is rushing. The mist will lift when it lifts. The light will spread when it spreads. There is no version of this dawn that arrives faster through anxious watching. You are standing at the edge of this field, and I want you to notice that you don't need to cross it today. You don't need to have a plan for every step between here and the trees on the far side. You only need to notice, for a few quiet breaths, that the field exists, open, patient, entirely unhurried, willing to be walked whenever you're ready, and equally willing to simply be looked at today from exactly where you're standing. Let your shoulders soften here, the way mist softens the sharp edges of a landscape it hasn't yet decided to reveal fully. Breathe in the particular cool quality of early morning air, even if the hour where you actually are is nothing like dawn at all. This clearing runs on its own time, not the clock's. When you're ready, we'll walk a little further together. Everything we've discussed so far is centered on your own private citadel, your own walls, your own gate, your own particular history of what got sealed away and why. But I want to widen the frame for a moment, because Marcus Aurelius, writing from the very center of the largest political and military structure of his era, understood something about comfort that extended far beyond any single person's inner life. Entire cultures build citadels too, and entire cultures conceal their own gates without a single individual consciously deciding to do so. Think about the particular architecture of comfort available to us now, in a way Marcus could scarcely have imagined from his cold military tent. Endless entertainment, available at the exact moment restlessness begins to stir, before that restlessness has the chance to ripen into anything resembling a real question. Algorithms built, quite deliberately, to keep offering exactly the kind of comfortable, frictionless content that keeps attention flowing smoothly, minute after minute, without ever demanding the kind of sustained, uncertain effort that real growth requires. An entire economy of convenience, engineered to remove friction from nearly every corner of daily life, often for genuinely good reasons, but with a quiet, cumulative cost that rarely gets named. A culture that has forgotten, collectively, what productive discomfort even feels like, and has come to treat its mere presence as a malfunction, requiring immediate correction. I raise this not to condemn convenience itself, which has relieved real and unnecessary suffering in countless ways, and not to suggest that discomfort is inherently virtuous simply for being uncomfortable. That would be its own kind of harsh, joyless philosophy, and it isn't what tonight has been building toward. I raise it because I think it helps explain why the pull toward permanent comfort feels, for so many of us, less like a personal failing and more like the water we've been swimming in since birth, so pervasive it barely registers as a current at all. This is worth naming honestly, because so much of the shame that can accompany a conversation like tonight's comes from treating comfort-seeking as a purely individual failure of will, when in fact it is being actively, expertly cultivated by systems with genuine financial interest in keeping your attention exactly where it currently rests. You are not simply weak-willed if you find the gate hard to open. You are, in part, contending with an entire cultural architecture built, quite intentionally, to make the courtyard as comfortable and as difficult to leave as modern engineering can possibly arrange. Understanding this does not remove your own responsibility for eventually walking toward the gate, but it does, I think, deserve to soften the shame that so often accompanies the noticing. You are not uniquely undisciplined. You are a person living inside a citadel that an entire civilization has quietly, collectively, spent enormous resources making as comfortable and as sealed as it currently is. I want to bring all of this down, out of theory now, into the actual, specific texture of your days, your relationships, your work, and the quiet, private conversation you carry on with yourself when no one else is listening. In relationships, the pull toward comfort often shows up as the conversation you keep postponing, because the relationship currently works well enough, and raising the honest thing risks disturbing an equilibrium that, while imperfect, at least feels familiar. I want to offer you a gentle reframe here. A relationship that can only survive by never being tested with honesty was never as stable as its surface comfort suggested. Marcus wrote extensively about the importance of living in accordance with nature, and one of the clearest applications of that idea to relationship is this: human connection, at its healthiest, is not a fragile thing requiring constant protection from truth. It is closer to that wind-tested tree we spoke of earlier, capable of growing stronger roots, specifically because it has weathered real, honest exchange, rather than being sheltered from it indefinitely. In work, comfort often shows up as staying within the exact boundaries of what's already proven, already safe, already certain to be well received, long after some part of you has quietly outgrown those boundaries. This doesn't mean recklessly abandoning stability for its own sake. Marcus was no advocate of impulsive upheaval, and neither is this conversation. It means noticing, honestly, when safe has become a permanent description rather than a temporary, reasonable choice for a particular season, and asking what one small, deliberate step beyond that safety might actually look like, taken not from anxiety, but from the same calm, considered will we discussed earlier. And in the quiet, private conversation with yourself, comfort often shows up as a familiar, well-worn story about your own limitations, the kind of person you've decided you simply are, The risks you've decided simply aren't for people like you. The growth you've quietly filed under someday, because entertaining it as a real possibility right now would require admitting how much you actually want it. This inner story deserves the same gentle scrutiny we've offered everything else tonight. It is worth asking, honestly, whether that story was ever actually true, or whether it was simply the most comfortable explanation available at a moment when the alternative, genuine, uncertain effort towards something that matters, felt like more than you could safely risk at the time. None of this requires a dramatic overhaul beginning tomorrow morning. It requires, simply, what we practiced together earlier, feeling the pull toward comfort, honestly when it arises, naming it plainly, breathing once to stay present rather than fleeing in either direction, and choosing, again and again, in small and sustainable ways, to test the gate rather than assuming, without ever checking, that it's permanently sealed. Rest here with me for a moment. Picture an old stone bridge, arching over a slow river, worn smooth in the middle by centuries of footsteps that came before yours. You are standing at one end of it, and on the other side, mist obscures whatever waits there. Not menacing mist, just the ordinary uncertainty of any place you haven't yet walked toward. Notice that the bridge itself has already done the difficult work. It has already been built, tested, weathered by storms you'll never have to witness firsthand. All that's being asked of you, in this particular moment, is not to build a bridge from nothing. It's simply to notice that one already exists, sturdy beneath the mist's uncertainty, ready to hold your weight whenever you choose to test it. You don't have to cross it today. Let that be entirely clear. You are allowed to stand here, at this end, for as long as you need, simply getting used to the sight of it, the solid stone underfoot where the path begins, the mist that will lift eventually, in its own unhurried time, the way mist always does. Breathe here a few moments longer. When you're ready, we'll continue. I want to bring your attention now to something the mind's careful reasoning often overlooks: the body and the particular way it keeps an honest record of where comfort has quietly calcified into something closer to stagnation. Marcus Aurelius, trained as he was in Stoic philosophy, wrote often about the body as something ultimately secondary to the mind's judgments, a view that made sense within his particular philosophical framework, where the will's relationship to circumstance mattered more than physical sensation itself. But I want to offer you something that complements his framework rather than contradicts it, drawing on what we now understand through modern research into the nervous system about how the body actually processes prolonged comfort and prolonged avoidance. Notice, over the coming days, the particular quality of restlessness that sometimes arrives in a body that has been sitting too long inside its own citadel, a kind of heaviness that isn't quite tiredness, a low, persistent unease that doesn't seem to have an obvious cause, a tightness that settles into the chest or the shoulders on days that were, by every external measure, perfectly comfortable and undemanding. This is often the body's own honest report, delivered in a language older and more direct than words, that something has gone still for longer than genuinely serves you. This is worth distinguishing carefully from ordinary, healthy rest, which tends to feel different in the body, expansive rather than compressed, genuinely restorative rather than dully persistent. Rest that serves you tends to leave the body feeling more spacious over time. Comfort that has calcified into avoidance tends to produce the opposite, a slow, accumulating heaviness that no amount of additional rest seems able to resolve, because what's actually needed isn't more stillness, but movement of a very particular kind, the kind that only comes from finally testing the gate rather than continuing to rest just inside it. I want to offer you a small, gentle practice here, similar in spirit to others we've built tonight. A few times a day, simply notice, without judgment, whether your body currently feels expansive or compressed. Not to fix it immediately, just to notice, the way you might check the weather before deciding what to wear. Over time, this noticing builds a kind of fluency that helps you distinguish genuine rest, which deserves your full trust and permission, from the particular telltale heaviness of a citadel that has quietly become a seal, a distinction your body, if you let it, will teach you to recognize far more reliably than your reasoning mind ever could on its own. There is a particular corner of this conversation that deserves its own careful attention, because so many people carry it without ever quite naming it. The comfort that develops after loss, and the strange, tangled way that growth in the aftermath of grief can sometimes feel like a kind of betrayal. If you have lost something significant, a person, a relationship, a version of your life that once felt certain and is now simply gone, you may know this particular flavor of comfort intimately. Staying still, staying exactly as you were in the immediate aftermath of that loss, can start to feel less like avoidance and more like devotion, as though moving forward, growing beyond the shape grief carved into your days, would somehow dishonor what or who you lost. I want to meet this directly because I think it deserves more care than a passing mention. This feeling is not irrational, and it is not something to simply reason your way out of through clever argument. It comes from a place of real love, real loyalty, a genuine unwillingness to let something that mattered simply fade into the past as though it never happened. That impulse deserves honor, not correction, and yet, gently, without contradicting any of that honor, I want to offer you a different way of understanding what growth after loss can actually mean. Marcus Aurelius, who buried multiple children during his lifetime, who lost close friends and colleagues to the plague sweeping through his empire, wrote about loss, not as something to move past quickly, but as something to be integrated honestly into a continuing, unfolding life, rather than allowed to seal that life shut entirely. He did not believe that continuing to live fully, continuing to grow, continuing to find meaning in new efforts and new relationships was a betrayal of what had been lost. He believed instead that it was the truest form of honor available, proof that what he had loved had shaped him into someone capable of continuing to engage with life fully, rather than someone permanently diminished by its absence. If some part of your own citadel was built in the aftermath of a loss, and some part of you fears that opening the gate again would mean leaving that loss behind, I want to offer you this instead. Growth does not require leaving anyone or anything behind. It requires only that you carry what you loved forward with you into whatever comes next, rather than asking it to stand permanently guard over a gate that both of you, if given an honest choice, might actually prefer to see opened again. I want to return to something we touched on briefly earlier and give it fuller attention now, because I think it offers one of the most reliable instruments available for locating exactly where your own citadel has sealed itself without your full awareness. The particular ache of watching someone else live the life you've quietly decided isn't available to you. You likely know this ache already. It arrives when you watch someone leave a comfortable, secure position to pursue something uncertain, and instead of simple admiration, you feel something sharper, something that lingers longer than a passing thought should. It arrives when an old friend makes a significant change, ends a relationship that had grown comfortable but hollow, begins a creative pursuit with no guarantee of any external reward, moves somewhere entirely new, without a fully formed plan for what happens next. And your reaction carries more weight than the situation, examined objectively, would seem to warrant. I want to offer you the same idea we explored in an earlier conversation about the shadow, applied here to the citadel instead. This disproportionate reaction is often not really about the other person at all. It is a signal, rising from your own inner landscape, pointing directly at your own sealed gate. The person who left their comfortable position is showing you, whether they intend to or not, that the gate you've quietly assumed was permanently closed was, in fact, never locked from the outside. It was only ever locked from within, and someone else, walking a path parallel to yours, has just demonstrated that the lock was never as final as it felt. This is uncomfortable to sit with, and I want to honor that discomfort rather than rush past it. It is far easier, in the moment, to explain away that ache with a story about circumstance. They had more support than I do, less to lose, better timing. Sometimes those explanations are entirely accurate, and I don't want to dismiss real differences in circumstance as though they don't matter. They do. But when the ache carries that particular, disproportionate charge, that lingering quality we identified before, it is worth asking, gently, without self-judgment, what if some part of me recognizes, in their choice, exactly the choice I've been quietly telling myself isn't mine to make? You don't need to act on this recognition immediately, or dramatically, or in a way that mirrors whatever choice sparked the ache in the first place. Your gate, your field beyond it, your own particular version of growth will look nothing like theirs, and it shouldn't. But the ache itself, examined honestly rather than explained away, is often one of the clearest, most reliable maps available to you, pointing directly toward the exact spot where your own courtyard has quietly convinced you that the walls were load-bearing, when in fact, all along, they were simply walls you'd stopped questioning. I want to tell you one more piece of Marcus Aurelius' story now, one that I think deepens everything we've discussed tonight, because it reveals something important about where his particular philosophy actually came from, and why it carries the weight of lived, hard-won understanding, rather than comfortable, theoretical distance. Long before Marcus ever wore the imperial purple, before he had any inkling of the burdens that would eventually be placed on his shoulders, he encountered the teachings of a man named Epictetus, a philosopher whose own life stood in the starkest possible contrast to the position Marcus would eventually occupy. Epictetus had been born into slavery in the Roman Empire, and it was during this period of profound, involuntary confinement that he developed the philosophical framework that would, generations later, shape the private thinking of an emperor who never met him in person, Epictetus, having died decades before Marcus was even born. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because I think it matters enormously to tonight's conversation. The philosophy of accepting what lies outside your control, while directing your full will toward what remains genuinely yours to shape. The very framework we explored earlier as the third quiet art was developed not by someone comfortable, not by someone free to walk through any gate he chose, but by a man who had been denied, through no fault of his own, nearly every external freedom a person can be denied. And it was precisely this severe restriction of external freedom that seems to have clarified, with unusual sharpness, exactly which freedoms remain genuinely untouchable, regardless of circumstance. the freedom to choose one's own judgments, one's own responses, one's own inner citadel, regardless of what chains the outer world might place around the body. Marcus, who would go on to inherit more external freedom and more external comfort than nearly any person alive in his era, found himself returning again and again to the teachings of a man who had possessed almost none of it. I think this detail carries a quiet, important lesson of its own. The warning against comfort was never really about how much external freedom or luxury a person happens to possess. It was about something entirely internal, whether the mind itself remains willing to grow, to question, to walk toward its own gate, regardless of how comfortable or how confined the external circumstances happen to be. This means the warning applies exactly as much to a life of genuine hardship as it does to a life of genuine ease. A person facing real external constraint can still choose growth within whatever internal freedom remains available to them, the way Epictetus did. And a person surrounded by every possible external comfort can still choose stagnation, the way history remembers Commodus having done. The citadel, in the end, was never really built from stone. It was built from the quality of a person's own inner willingness, and that willingness, Marcus seemed to understand with unusual clarity, remains available to be chosen freshly in every single circumstance, regardless of what the surrounding walls happen to be made of. Rest here with me once more. Picture a long road stretching out ahead of you, disappearing over a gentle rise you can't quite see past. You are not standing at the very beginning of this road. You've already walked some distance to arrive exactly where you're standing now, though the specific miles behind you might be hard to measure from inside the walking itself. Notice that you don't need to see the entire road at once in order to take the next step. The road does not require your full understanding of where it eventually leads before it's willing to hold your weight for the next mile. It simply continues, patient, steady, beneath your feet, exactly as far as you're currently able to see, and considerably further. Besides, let your shoulders soften here, the way a traveler's shoulders soften once they stop trying to see the whole journey at once and simply trust the ground beneath their next footstep. Breathe slowly, matching the unhurried pace of a road that has never once demanded to be walked faster than a person can honestly walk it. When you're ready, we'll continue just a little further. Before we move toward the close of our time together, I want to clear away some confusion that tends to gather around this subject, because I think it will help you carry tonight's conversation more accurately into the days ahead. This warning is not permission to be endlessly hard on yourself. I have seen this misunderstanding often, and I want to head it off directly. Someone hears a warning, like tonight's, and begins applying it relentlessly, treating every restful evening as evidence of failure, every comfortable choice as a moral lapse requiring correction, every ordinary human need for ease as something shameful to be pushed through. This is not what Marcus Aurelius practiced, and it is not what we've built together tonight. He rested. He grieved openly in his private pages. He acknowledged, repeatedly, his own exhaustion, his own longing for a simpler life. The warning was never against comfort itself, only against comfort, mistaken for a permanent, unquestioned destination. This warning is not a demand for constant visible achievement. Growth, in the sense we've been exploring tonight, has almost nothing to do with external, measurable accomplishment. This conversation has deliberately avoided that entire vocabulary all evening for good reason. A person can grow enormously in ways that produce no visible external result at all. A difficult forgiveness finally offered, a private honesty finally spoken, a single fear finally faced, without an audience present to witness or applaud it. Growth, understood this way, requires no external proof to be entirely real. This warning is not a single event with a clean before and after. I want to gently discourage any version of this conversation that leaves you thinking, there's a finish line here, a moment where you will have grown enough and can settle permanently into a final, completed version of yourself. That was not how Marcus understood the work, and it is not how it unfolds in an actual life. The citadel gets built again, in small ways, even after the gate has been opened many times before. This is not failure. It is simply the ongoing, lifelong texture of what it means to remain a living, changing person rather than a finished statue standing permanently still. And this warning is not a substitute for genuine rest, when rest is what's actually needed. If what you're carrying right now is real exhaustion, the kind that needs tending before any gate can be honestly approached, I want to say clearly that resting is not a failure of tonight's practice. It is, in fact, one of the 3 quiet arts in action. Seeing your actual circumstance clearly, acting in alignment with what you genuinely need, and releasing your grip on some imagined timeline that says growth should already have happened by now. Sometimes, the most aligned action available to you is precisely to stay in the courtyard a while longer, honestly, consciously, until you're genuinely ready for what lies beyond the gate. I want to close the practical portion of tonight's conversation with a simple, sustainable rhythm you can return to loosely in whatever shape actually fits your days, rather than as one more rigid obligation layered on top of an already full life. In the mornings, before the day's demands arrive in full, consider a single, unhurried breath paired with a simple question. Is there a gate I've been standing in front of that I'm ready to test today, even in some small way? Some mornings the honest answer will be no, and that's a complete answer, deserving no guilt. Other mornings something will surface, a conversation, a small first step, a single honest sentence you've been rehearsing in private for longer than you'd like to admit. Across the day, whenever you notice the pull toward comfort, arriving in a moment that seems to be asking for something else, return to the gate practice. Feel it, name it, breathe, once, to stay present. Choose, consciously, what happens next. This rarely takes more than a few seconds, and it doesn't require you to interrupt your day dramatically, only to notice, gently, before the old, automatic pattern takes over, uninterrupted. In the evenings, if it feels right, consider a brief, unforced reflection, not an exhaustive journaling practice, simply a quiet question held for a few moments before sleep. Did I meet today with genuine contentment, or did some part of it slip into complacency without my noticing? You don't need a perfect answer. The question itself, asked honestly and regularly, does most of the necessary work over time. And once a week, if you're able, consider climbing your own watchtower for 20 unhurried minutes, not to solve anything, not to force a plan into existence, but simply to look out over the wider field beyond your current walls, and notice, honestly, whether the season feels ready for a longer walk, or whether it still calls for a while longer in the harbor's calm water. This rhythm asks nothing dramatic of you. It is not a program with a start date and a finish line. It is, like everything else tonight, an ongoing practice of soft duty toward your own unfolding life. Small, patient, and over months and years, quietly transformative in a way no single sweeping resolution ever could be. One more pause before we continue further into the evening. Picture a single lantern hung on the outer wall of the citadel, its light spilling just past the edge of the stone and into the dark field beyond. It does not illuminate the whole field. It was never meant to. It simply marks the beginning of a path, a small, steady circle of visibility at the very threshold between what's known and what isn't yet. You don't need the whole field lit before you're allowed to take a single step into it. You only need this, one small circle of light, enough to see where your next footstep might safely land, trusting that the light will keep moving with you, circle by circle, for as far as you actually need to walk tonight. Let your breathing settle here, matching the steady, unhurried flicker of that lantern, in and out. Nothing beyond this present small circle of light is required of you right now. When you're ready, we'll continue. I want to introduce one more Stoic idea now, one closely associated with the broader tradition Marcus belonged to, though the specific Latin phrase most commonly used to describe it, amor fati, love of fate, became more fully developed by later thinkers building on the Stoic foundation. I want to offer it to you tonight because I think it resolves a tension that might have been quietly building throughout this entire conversation. How do we reconcile accepting our circumstances fully and without resentment, with also believing that growth beyond our current comfort matters? Here is the resolution, and I think it's genuinely beautiful once it settles. Amor fati does not mean passive resignation to whatever currently exists, as though acceptance and growth were opposites, pulling in different directions. It means something far more active, loving your circumstances enough, exactly as they are right now, to engage with them fully, rather than resenting them from a safe, comfortable distance. And it is precisely this full engagement, this refusal to hold your actual life at arm's length, while waiting for some better version of it to arrive, that makes genuine growth possible in the first place. Think about the difference between two people facing the same difficult circumstance. One resents it, wishes it were different, spends considerable energy imagining an alternate life where this particular difficulty never happened, and remains, in some important sense, only half present to the actual life in front of them. The other accepts the circumstance fully, not with passive defeat, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that this, exactly this, is the material available to work with, and from that full acceptance discovers a kind of energy and clarity that resentment never allows. Marcus, writing from that cold military camp, embodied this distinction more fully than perhaps any other historical figure we could point to. He did not want to be at war. He said as much, repeatedly, in his private pages. He would have preferred, by his own account, the quiet life of a philosopher, undisturbed by the enormous burdens of empire. And yet, rather than resenting his actual circumstance from a comfortable emotional distance, he engaged with it as fully and as honestly as any person in his position could have, not because he loved war, but because he understood that loving his actual, present circumstance, however difficult, was the only path toward meeting it with the kind of clarity and growth genuine engagement makes possible. This matters for tonight's warning, because it offers a gentler way to understand the relationship between your current citadel and the gate beyond it. You are not being asked to resent the comfort you've built, or to treat your current life as a mistake requiring correction. You are being invited to love it fully enough, this actual, present life, exactly as it currently exists, to engage with it honestly, including the parts of it that have quietly gone still, rather than holding it at the comfortable distance of vague, unexamined dissatisfaction. that never quite becomes clear enough to act on. I want to offer you a story now, in the spirit of the kind of teaching tale that circulated through the ancient philosophical schools Marcus himself studied, though this particular telling is my own, offered gently, the way stories are meant to be passed along. There was once a gardener who inherited a walled orchard from her family, planted generations before by hands she never met. The orchard was beautiful and productive, its trees old and reliable, bearing fruit every season, without much need for her intervention. She tended it faithfully, and for many years, this was enough. The walls kept out the harsher winds. The gate, though present, rarely needed opening, because everything she needed seemed to exist already within the orchard's boundaries. One year, an old traveler passed through and asked to rest beneath her trees. As they sat together, he mentioned, almost in passing, that beyond the far hill, past fields she'd never walked, there was soil unlike any she'd worked before. Rich, untested ground that might grow varieties of fruit. Her own orchard, however lovely, had never once produced. She thanked him for the information and thought little more of it. Her orchard, after all, was already good. Why risk the walk, the uncertain soil, the very real possibility that nothing she planted there would grow at all, when what she already had was reliable, known, sufficient? Years passed this way. The orchard remained lovely, but something in her, quietly, without her fully noticing, had grown restless in a way. Tending the same familiar trees no longer seemed to soothe. She found herself, more and more often, standing near the gate at dusk, looking toward the hill the traveler had mentioned, though she never quite worked up the will to walk through and see for herself. One evening, an early frost came unexpectedly, damaging several of her oldest trees she had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, would simply continue, bearing fruit, forever, exactly as they always had. Tending to the damage, she found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain about her orchard's future, and in that uncertainty, something unexpected happened. The fear she'd been quietly protecting herself from by staying inside the walls no longer felt like the worst available outcome. The worst outcome, she realized, standing among her damaged trees, would have been never finding out what grew on the other side of that hill at all. She walked through the gate the following spring. The soil beyond it was, indeed, difficult, nothing like the easy, established ground within her walls. Her first attempts largely failed. But something else grew alongside those early failures, a kind of aliveness in her daily work that the reliable, unchanging orchard, for all its comfort, had quietly stopped providing years before. She kept both, in the end. The old orchard, tended with the same faithful care as always, and the new, uncertain field beyond the hill, worked patiently, season after season, never quite as reliable as what she'd inherited, but entirely, unmistakably her own, in a way the inherited orchard, however lovely, had never fully been. Rest with me once more. Picture your hand resting flat against an old stone wall. Not the wall of the citadel we've imagined all evening, just an ordinary garden wall, warm from a day of sun, rough beneath your palm. Feel, in your imagination, the particular texture of stone that's been standing a long time, worn smooth in places by countless other hands that rested here before yours. You don't need to climb this wall right now. You don't need to decide, in this exact moment, what lies on the other side of it, or whether you're ready to find out. You only need to notice the simple, steady fact of your own hand against something solid, something that has held its shape through many seasons and will go on holding its shape long after this particular evening has ended. Breathe here for a few moments, feeling that quiet solidity beneath your palm. There is nothing urgent in this clearing, just stone and warmth and the unhurried permission to simply rest here as long as you need before we walk any further. When you're ready, we'll continue. I want to offer you something different now, not more explanation, but an extended, unhurried space to simply sit with everything we've discussed tonight. Let this be less like a lecture and more like a long, quiet walk beside someone in no rush to arrive anywhere in particular. Settle a little more deeply into wherever you're resting. Let your hands go loose. There is nothing for them to hold on to during this next stretch of time. Think, if you're willing, of the citadel we've walked through together tonight. The walls, the courtyard, the gate that may have gone quiet with disuse. You don't need to walk through it right now. I want to be very clear about that, because some part of you, hearing all of this, may feel a pull to force the matter, immediately, to march toward the gate this very moment, determined to prove, once and for all, that you're capable of growth, that tonight will finally be the night everything changes. That urgency is worth noticing gently, because it too is a familiar pattern, perhaps even a subtler form of the very comfort-seeking we've spent this hour examining. The comfort of dramatic, decisive action, standing in for the slower, less glamorous work of honest, sustained attention. Let that urgency soften here in this extended quiet. The gate will still be there tomorrow. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer, while you simply practice tonight the more foundational skill beneath all of this work, staying present with uncertainty without immediately needing to resolve it through either forced action or continued avoidance. Picture yourself instead simply standing at the gate, not walking through it, not walking back toward the courtyard either, just standing, aware of the field beyond, aware that something in you has grown curious about what waits there, and aware, too, that you are no longer required to pretend the field doesn't exist at all. Notice how that feels. Not opening, not avoiding, just acknowledging. For many people, this middle position is itself a profound relief, because so much of the restlessness we carry comes not from the field itself, but from the enormous, ongoing effort of pretending we've never noticed the gate in the first place. The moment you stop pretending, even without walking a single step further, something in the whole system relaxes, the way a hand relaxes. The instant it stops gripping something it had forgotten it was even holding. Stay here for a while. Breathe in. Let the exhale be a little longer than the inhale, if that feels natural. In through the nose, if that's comfortable. Out slowly, like a long, unhurried sigh you've been owed for longer than you realized. You have a citadel. You have a gate. Something waits beyond it, and it is not your enemy. It is simply the next honest chapter of a life that has, for good reasons, spent a season resting inside familiar walls. That acknowledgement is enough for tonight. It is in fact more than enough. It is the entire beginning of everything that follows. I want to name something directly here because I think it clarifies the entire spirit of tonight's conversation, and it involves a word we've been carefully avoiding: discipline. Our culture tends to treat discipline as a harsh, gritted teeth kind of virtue. The sterner the regimen, the more admirable the person following it, as though worth were something earned exclusively through suffering, cheerfully endured. This framework has very little to offer the work we've done together tonight, and in many cases actively works against it, because genuine growth, the kind we've been discussing, cannot be forced through sheer willpower any more than a stuck gate opens faster through angrier pulling. But there is a different quality, one this conversation has circled around all evening without fully naming until now: self-respect. Not the achievement-based version that says I only deserve regard once I've proven my worth through visible accomplishment. A quieter, older version, closer to what Marcus actually seemed to practice in his own private pages. The kind that says, I owe myself the honesty of not pretending my citadel is the whole world, because I respect myself too much to let comfort quietly narrow my one life without at least being asked, honestly, whether that's what I actually want. This distinction matters enormously for how you carry the gate practice forward. If you approach it as one more discipline to master, one more habit to perfect, one more area where you might fail, and therefore feel worse about yourself than before you started, you've accidentally smuggled the old, exhausting framework back into a practice specifically designed to interrupt it. The gate practice is not a discipline. It is an act of self-respect offered to your own unfolding life, the same way you'd offer patience to a friend, honestly wrestling with an uncertain, worthwhile decision. Self-respect, understood this way, has no failure condition. There is no version of tonight, or next month, or next year, where you have grown incorrectly, or not quickly enough compared to some imagined timeline. There is only the ongoing, unhurried practice of treating your own life with the same soft duty you would naturally extend to someone you loved, standing at their own gate, uncertain and deserving of patience rather than pressure. I want to spend some time now on something that tends to surface quietly once a person begins truly considering their own citadel honestly. A kind of grief, or even anger, directed backward at all the years already spent inside walls that, in retrospect, might not have needed to be quite so high, quite so long, unquestioned. This is a natural response, and I want to honor it, rather than rush past it. Once you can see the gate clearly, once you understand that it was never actually locked from the outside, it can be painful to reckon with how many seasons passed while you assumed otherwise. There can be real grief in this, for opportunities that quietly closed while you waited for a comfort that was never actually going to fully arrive, for relationships left untested by honesty, for creative work never attempted because the walls felt, at the time, like the entire boundary of what was possible. I want to offer you something gentle here, the same offering we made in an earlier conversation about a different kind of hidden room. Forgiveness, extended first, and most importantly, toward yourself. Not forgiveness that pretends the years don't matter, or that rushes past the grief before it's had its say. Forgiveness that simply recognizes, honestly, that the person who built those walls, season after season, was doing the best they could with the understanding, the resources, and the courage available to them at the time. You did not know, back then, what you know now. That is not a failure of character. It is simply the ordinary shape of how understanding actually develops in a real life. Not all at once, in a single blinding moment of clarity, but slowly, through exactly the kind of accumulated reflection you've been engaged in throughout this hour. The years spent behind the wall were not wasted, even if part of you wants to name them that way in a moment of frustration. They were the years in which the wall itself needed to be fully built, fully tested, fully lived inside, before you could ever have developed the clarity to recognize it as a wall at all, rather than simply the unquestioned shape of your entire world. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself night after night, was not writing to a person who had already mastered everything he was reminding himself to remember. He was writing again and again, precisely because he kept forgetting, kept slipping back into smaller, more comfortable versions of his own thinking, kept needing the same reminders repeated across years of pages. If even he required this much patient repetition, this much gentle, ongoing forgiveness for his own forgetting, I think we can extend ourselves the same grace, generously, without demanding that we should have known better, sooner, than the actual pace of our own honest unfolding ever allowed. Rest here with me a moment longer. Picture a slow, wide river again, the kind we visited in an earlier conversation, moving at its own unhurried pace toward a sea you cannot yet see from where you're standing. Notice how little effort the river spends worrying about its own progress. It does not measure itself against faster rivers or apologize for the wide, slow bends that take it longer to reach the sea than a straighter, more urgent current might manage. Let yourself be this river for a few breaths. Let whatever pace your own growth has taken, however slow, however winding, however many wide bends it's required to reach exactly where you are right now, be entirely acceptable, exactly as it is, without needing to justify itself against some faster, more direct current you imagine other people traveling. Breathe in, breathe out, slow and unhurried, matching the current's own patient rhythm. You will reach the sea. Every river does, eventually, regardless of how many bends the land requires along the way. When you're ready, we'll continue. I want to introduce one more concept before we move toward the later stretch of tonight's conversation, because I think it protects everything we've discussed from tipping into a harsher, more reckless version of itself. The idea of a safe container. Growth, pursued without care, without a stable foundation to hold it, can become its own kind of harm. The sudden, dramatic upheaval that burns down an entire life in the name of authenticity, leaving behind consequences that a more patient, considered approach might have avoided. Marcus Aurelius, for all his emphasis on facing hardship honestly, was not an advocate of reckless, impulsive change. He held enormous responsibility throughout his adult life, an empire, a family, an army, depending on his steady judgment, and he did not abandon any of it in pursuit of some dramatic personal transformation. His growth happened within a stable container. His daily responsibilities, his ongoing relationships, the steady structure of an examined life, continuing alongside its gradual unfolding. I want to offer you the same permission. Testing your own gate does not require dismantling the entire courtyard behind you. In fact, the courtyard, the stable relationships, the reliable routines, the parts of your current life that genuinely serve you, functions as exactly the kind of safe container that makes honest growth sustainable rather than destructive. A tree needs both the wind that strengthens its roots and the steady, unmoving earth those roots grow into. Remove the earth entirely in pursuit of more wind, and you don't get a stronger tree. You get an uprooted one. If, at any point in this work, something surfaces that feels larger than your current container can safely hold, an impulse toward dramatic, immediate upheaval that leaves you feeling less stable rather than more aligned, that is not a sign you failed at tonight's practice. It is a sign simply that the container needs reinforcing before the growth continues, whether through the support of a trusted person, professional guidance, or simply more time spent steadying the ordinary rhythms of your daily life before walking further through the gate. This entire hour, in its own way, is meant to function as a small piece of that container too. a place you can return to again and again whenever the field beyond your walls feels like more than you want to face. Without company, I want to spend some time now on something Marcus Aurelius wrote about with striking consistency throughout his private journal: the particular freedom available to a person who stops outsourcing their own verdict about their life to the opinions of everyone else watching it. Think about how much of what keeps a gate sealed shut has nothing to do with the field beyond it, and everything to do with an imagined audience. The people who might judge an uncertain attempt, the family members who might not understand a change in direction, the old version of yourself, remembered by others, that a new attempt might seem to contradict. Marcus, despite occupying one of the most publicly scrutinized positions available in the ancient world, wrote to himself, again and again, about the importance of caring less about this imagined audience and more about the quiet, private alignment between his actions and his own considered judgment of what mattered. This is not a call to disregard other people entirely, or to treat their genuine wisdom and care as irrelevant. Marcus valued counsel from those he trusted, and this conversation is not suggesting you should isolate yourself from honest, loving input either. What it is a call toward is something more precise, noticing when the voice holding your gate shut is not actually your own honest judgment about what's wise or unwise, but a borrowed, imagined verdict from people who may not even be paying nearly as much attention to your life as your own anxious imagination assumes they are. Marcus observed, with a kind of gentle amusement in some of his private writing, how quickly people's opinions shift, how little consistency exists in the judgments of a crowd, how much energy a person can waste trying to satisfy an audience whose actual verdict, examined honestly, changes from day to day and rarely holds the weight we assign it in the anxious privacy of our own minds. This observation was not meant to produce contempt for other people. It was meant to produce a kind of liberation, the recognition that the opinion actually capable of keeping your gate sealed forever was never really theirs. It was always, quietly, your own, borrowing their imagined faces to give itself a more convincing disguise. I want to offer you a small, gentle question to carry forward from tonight. The next time you notice yourself hesitating at the gate because of what someone else might think, ask honestly, is this actually their verdict, spoken clearly and directly to me? Or is it a verdict I've quietly assigned to them on their behalf without ever actually checking whether it's true? Very often, when you look closely, the audience holding you back turns out to be far smaller, far less certain, and far less invested in your particular gate than the version living rent-free in your own private imagination. I want to offer you now one of Marcus Aurelius's most striking and most frequently returned to practices, one that scholars of his work often call the view from above, a technique he used repeatedly throughout his private pages to gain perspective on troubles that felt, in the immediate moment, larger than they actually were. The practice is simple to describe, even though its effect can be profound. Marcus would imagine his own life and the particular difficulty currently occupying his attention as though seen from a great height, first from above the room he sat in, then above the city, then higher still, above the entire empire, above the curve of the earth itself, until his own concerns, his own citadel, his own gate, and all its careful walls became a single small point among countless others, glimpsed briefly from an almost cosmic distance. This was not for Marcus an exercise in feeling small or insignificant in some despairing sense. It was, instead, a way of interrupting the particular kind of tunnel vision that keeps a person locked inside an exaggerated version of their own difficulty. The sense that this particular fear, this particular risk, this particular gate carries a weight so enormous it justifies permanent avoidance. From the height of that wider view, the fear remains real, but its proportions shift. It becomes possible to see it clearly, as one difficulty among the countless difficulties every living thing has ever faced, and in most cases, survived. I want to invite you into a brief version of this practice now, gently, the way we have with every image tonight. Picture your own life, right now, as though seen from just above the room you're in. Then imagine rising further, above the building, above the street, above the town or city holding you, high enough to see the wider landscape, the rivers and roads stretching in every direction. Rise further still, if you're willing, until you can imagine the whole curve of the world beneath you, countless other citadels scattered across its surface, each one holding someone else's version of tonight's exact question, whether to stay sheltered or whether to test the gate. From this height, notice how your own particular fear, examined honestly, takes its place among countless others, not diminished in importance, exactly, but placed correctly, in proportion, among the vast, ongoing, ordinary business of being alive on this particular planet, in this particular era, for this particular brief and precious stretch of time. Marcus found, again and again, that this wider view did not make him careless about his own life. It made him clearer about what genuinely mattered within it, freed, at least for a moment, from the exaggerated weight that proximity alone had been quietly adding to an otherwise ordinary difficulty. Come back down, slowly when you're ready, carrying that clarity with you. The gate is still there, exactly as before, but perhaps it looks now a little more like what it actually is, one modest threshold in one modest life, among the countless thresholds every living thing that has ever existed has had to eventually decide whether to cross. Let's rest here a little longer, staying with the height we just visited. Picture the sky itself now, wide and unbothered, stretching in every direction, beyond the edges of whatever view you can actually see from where you're sitting. Notice that the sky has never once needed to resolve anything in order to remain exactly as vast as it already is. It simply holds everything beneath it, every citadel, every gate, every hesitant person standing at their own threshold tonight, without needing a single one of them to hurry toward a decision before it's ready. Let yourself be held by that same unbothered vastness for a few breaths. You do not need to resolve your own gate tonight in order to be worthy of this wide, patient sky, continuing to hold you exactly as gently as it's holding everyone else beneath it right now, in this same unhurried moment. Breathe slowly, here, in and out. There's room enough, under a sky this wide, for every pace of growth, every season of shelter, every honest uncertainty you're currently carrying. When you're ready, we'll continue. I want to draw one more important distinction before we move toward the close of tonight's teaching, because I think it protects this entire conversation from being misapplied in a way that could cause real harm. The difference between growth and escape. They can look remarkably similar from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, at least in the first exhilarated moments of a dramatic change. Both involve leaving something familiar. Both involve a kind of risk, a kind of uncertainty, a departure from the comfortable courtyard we've discussed all evening. But underneath that surface similarity, They are moving in entirely different directions, and learning to tell them apart matters enormously for whether the field beyond your gate turns out to be genuine growth or simply a more elaborate, more exhausting version of the same avoidance you are already practicing. Growth moves towards something, a value you've clarified, a capacity you want to develop, an honest alignment between your daily life and what you've come to understand actually matters to you. It tends to remain steady even when the initial excitement fades, because it was never dependent on excitement in the first place. It was dependent on alignment, which continues to matter on the difficult days just as much as the inspired ones. Escape moves away from something. Discomfort, boredom, an unresolved fear, a difficult relationship or circumstance that hasn't been faced honestly. It often carries the same initial energy as growth, the same sense of finally doing something different after a long season of stillness. But because it was never actually oriented toward a value, only away from a discomfort, it tends to lose its energy the moment the initial thrill of departure fades, often leaving a person standing in an entirely new field, surrounded by entirely new uncertainty, having simply relocated the same unexamined patterns, rather than genuinely transforming their relationship to them. Marcus Aurelius, for all his emphasis on facing hardship honestly, never encouraged reckless departure from one's actual responsibilities in pursuit of some more exciting, more comfortable alternative elsewhere. His own life offers the clearest possible illustration of this distinction. He did not escape the burdens of his empire in pursuit of the quiet, philosophical life he privately, repeatedly admitted to wanting. He grew within his actual circumstances, engaging honestly with the difficulty directly in front of him, rather than fantasizing about a different, more comfortable difficulty somewhere else. I want to offer you a simple question to help distinguish your own gate from a disguised escape hatch. Am I moving towards something I've honestly clarified as mattering to me? Or am I simply moving away from a discomfort I haven't yet faced directly? If the honest answer is the second, that doesn't mean the discomfort doesn't deserve attention. It very well might, but it may deserve attention exactly where you currently stand, through the quiet, unglamorous work of the gate practice we built together earlier, rather than through a dramatic departure that simply carries the same unfaced discomfort along with you into an entirely new setting. I want to name something now that I think deserves its own space, because it's so easy, in a conversation, this focused on warning, on discomfort, on the discipline of facing what's difficult, to forget that the ultimate direction of all this effort points somewhere warmer than where we began. People who genuinely begin testing their own gate, gently and honestly over time, often report something they don't fully expect going in. Not triumph, not some dramatic peak of achievement, but a quiet, steady return of ordinary aliveness to days that had, without their fully noticing, gone gray at the edges. A conversation feels more present because it's honest rather than merely comfortable. A meal tastes more fully of itself when it isn't simply another item in a long, undifferentiated stretch of identical cautious days. Sleep comes more easily, not because life has become easier in any external sense, but because the particular, low-grade exhaustion of holding a gate shut against your own honest longing finally has somewhere else to go. This matters because I don't want tonight's warning to leave you bracing for a harder, more demanding life ahead, as though growth were simply one more form of suffering to be endured for the sake of some distant, uncertain reward. That was never Marcus's actual experience of this work, and it need not be yours. The point of testing the gate was never to make your life more difficult for its own sake. It was to restore the particular, quiet vividness that a life fully engaged with, rather than carefully protected from, tends to carry, almost as a natural byproduct, once the exhausting work of constant avoidance is finally set down. You are allowed this ordinary aliveness. You do not have to earn it through some grand, completed transformation before it's permitted to arrive. It is available to you now, in fragments, the moment you take even one small, honest step through the gate. We've spent this hour standing before together, not because the step itself guarantees some dramatic reward, but because the simple, honest act of engaging with your actual life, rather than a carefully guarded, increasingly narrow version of it, has a way of returning color to days that had, for entirely understandable reasons, quietly gone quiet. I want to speak directly, for a moment, to a particular kind of listener I suspect makes up a good portion of this audience tonight. The person who hears a conversation about growth and feels not inspiration, but a fresh wave of exhaustion, because so much of their life already feels like an unbroken series of demands they never quite get to rest from. If this describes you, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. Tonight's warning was never meant for you in the way it might sound at first. You are not the person quietly, comfortably avoiding a gate out of unexamined ease. You are, more likely, someone who has been walking through gates constantly for years, often without anyone noticing or acknowledging the effort it took, simply because circumstance never allowed you the luxury of a settled, comfortable courtyard to rest inside in the first place. For someone in this position, the most aligned action available right now may not be another gate at all. It may be simply rest, genuine, unhurried, unguilty rest, the kind Marcus himself wrote about needing and rarely finding, surrounded as he was by the endless demands of an empire that never seemed to grant him a real season of shelter. If tonight's conversation stirred something closer to defensiveness or fatigue than curiosity, I want you to trust that reaction. It may be telling you something true and important, that your citadel, right now, is not sealed, shut out of avoidance. It is simply, finally, doing what a citadel is supposed to do, holding you safely while you recover from seasons of effort that have already asked far more of you than most people around you likely realize. The 3 quiet arts we discussed earlier apply here just as much as anywhere else in tonight's conversation. Seeing your actual circumstance clearly means recognizing, honestly, when what's being asked of you by a message like this one doesn't actually fit your particular season. Acting in alignment means choosing rest, deliberately and without guilt, when rest is genuinely what alignment calls for, and releasing your grip on outcomes outside your control means letting go of any lingering sense that you should be doing more, growing faster, testing more gates, when what your actual life has been quietly asking of you this whole time is simply permission to stop. You are allowed to receive tonight's warning as it was truly intended, not as one more demand added to an already overloaded life, but as an invitation you're free to set gently aside until a season arrives when you actually have the spare capacity to consider it. That season may not be now. That's not a failure. It's simply honest information about where you currently stand. And honesty, as we've discussed all evening, is always the more aligned choice than performing an energy for growth you don't currently have available to spend. Rest here with me once more. Picture roots. Deep beneath the surface of a tree, you cannot fully see from where you're standing. Roots that have been doing their quiet, essential work for years. long before any visible growth appeared above ground. You cannot see them directly. You have to trust that they're there, doing what roots do, holding everything steady, even during seasons when nothing above the surface seems to be changing at all. If you're someone who has been giving, holding, carrying for a long time, let this image remind you that your own roots have likely been doing exactly this kind of essential, invisible work for far longer than anyone above the surface has probably noticed or thanked you for. That work counts. It has always counted, even without visible acknowledgement. Breathe here a few moments longer, imagining those deep, patient roots holding steady beneath you, asking nothing further of you right now except to simply rest above them, trusting that the holding is already, quietly, more than enough. When you're ready, we'll continue toward the close of our time together. Before we move into the final close, I want to offer one small practical reflection on language, because so much of tonight's work has depended on the particular vocabulary we've used, and I think it's worth naming why that choice matters. You may have noticed that certain words never appeared across this hour. Words like success, productivity, hype, optimization, motivation, failure. This was not accidental. Those words belong to a framework this conversation has deliberately set aside, because that framework tends to treat growth the same way it treats a quarterly target, as something to be measured, accelerated, and compared against an external benchmark, usually someone else's life, rarely your own honest values. Marcus Aurelius did not write to himself using this vocabulary either, and I think that omission matters. He wrote about alignment, about virtue, about the quiet, private decency of acting rightly, regardless of external reward or recognition. He wrote about duty, soft duty in the language we've used tonight, the kind directed inward toward your own honest unfolding, rather than outward toward proving something to an audience. This is why the vocabulary of hustle culture sits so uneasily alongside his actual philosophy, despite how frequently his words get borrowed in shortened, flattened form to decorate exactly that kind of harsh, comparison-driven striving. I want to invite you, in the days ahead, to notice which vocabulary you reach for when you think about your own gait. If you catch yourself reaching for the language of optimization, I should have grown more by now. I'm falling behind. I'm failing at becoming who I'm supposed to be. I want you to remember tonight and gently reach instead for the vocabulary we've practiced here. Not I need to hustle toward growth, but I am tending my own honest alignment. Not I've failed to test my gait this month, but I am walking a long road at the pace that's actually mine, and that pace has never once needed anyone else's permission to be enough. I want to offer one more reflection before we gather everything together, because I think it addresses a quiet fear that may have been sitting underneath tonight's entire conversation. The fear that growth, if no one ever witnesses it, if it never produces some visible, external legacy, somehow doesn't count. Marcus Aurelius wrote, with striking consistency, about the emptiness of chasing posthumous fame, of caring too much about how future generations might remember him. This might seem, at first, like a strange thing for a Roman emperor to write, a man whose actions were, by the nature of his position, unusually likely to be recorded and remembered, regardless of his own wishes on the matter. And yet he returned to this theme often, reminding himself that the opinion of people not yet born, people he would never meet, whose values and circumstances he could not possibly predict, was an even less reliable audience to perform for than the living crowd we discussed earlier. What he valued instead and what I want to offer you as a genuine alternative to the exhausting pursuit of visible legacy was the private, immediate alignment between his actions and his own honest sense of what was right, regardless of whether anyone, now or in the future, ever fully appreciated it. A single day lived with integrity, unnoticed by history, mattered to him exactly as much as a day that happened to be recorded for posterity. The virtue was in the alignment itself, not in the witnessing of it. I want to offer you this same permission tonight. Your own gate does not need to lead somewhere impressive enough to justify itself to an audience, real or imagined. The honest conversation you finally have does not need to become a story you tell later to prove your own growth to someone else. The creative work you finally attempt does not need external recognition in order to have been worth the uncertain effort of attempting it. Marcus understood, and I think it's one of the most quietly liberating ideas in his entire body of work, that a life aligned with what actually matters is complete in itself, regardless of who's watching, regardless of whether it ever becomes a legacy anyone remembers beyond the honest, private fact of having been lived that way. Before we close, I want to gather up what we've walked through tonight, gently, the way you might gather stones from a riverbank at the end of a long walk. Not to carry every single one home, but to hold them briefly and notice their weight before setting most of them back down. We began by landing in the body, learning that the pull toward comfort is not a moral failure, but an old, trustworthy instinct, a harbor doing exactly what harbors are built to do. We met the citadel, the walls that once offered genuine shelter, and may, without our full awareness, have quietly become a seal. We met Marcus Aurelius, not as a distant marble statue, but as a reluctant emperor, writing privately to himself in a cold military camp, warning himself against exactly the comfort that his own position made so readily available. We looked at the striking, historically documented contrast between Marcus's disciplined private philosophy and the very different path taken by his own son, a contrast that illustrated, more vividly than any abstract argument could, exactly what unchecked comfort can quietly do to character across even a single generation. We learned to distinguish contentment from complacency, shelter from ceiling, growth from escape, distinctions that protect this entire body of work from collapsing into either harsh, restless striving on one side or comfortable, unexamined stagnation on the other. We built a practice together, the gate practice, 4 soft movements requiring no harsh discipline, only honest attention. Feel, name, breathe, choose. We explored the 3 quiet arts Marcus returned to throughout his private writing: the art of seeing clearly, the art of acting in alignment, and the art of releasing your grip on what was never yours to control. We climbed the watchtower together, and later, the wider view from above, learning to hold our own particular fears in proportion to the vast, ongoing, ordinary business of being alive. We talked about memento mori, not as a threat, but as a gift, the awareness of mortality, dissolving false urgency around the wrong things while clarifying real urgency around what actually matters. We talked about amor fati, loving your actual circumstances fully enough to engage with them honestly, rather than resenting them from a comfortable distance. We talked about the safe container every genuine growth requires, about forgiving the years already spent behind the wall, about the particular ache of watching someone else test a gate you'd quietly assumed was closed to you. And we talked, too, about the ones who are already carrying too much, for whom tonight's warning was never meant to add one more demand, but simply to be received gently and set aside for a season, whenever rest is what alignment actually requires. None of this was offered to you as a program to complete, a checklist to finish, or a version of yourself to achieve by some future deadline. It was offered simply as a companion for one evening, a lantern held steady on the wall, for as long as you needed it, while you looked gently at a gate you may have spent a very long time, convinced was permanently sealed. I want to offer one more piece of reassurance before we move toward the very close of tonight's conversation, because I suspect it addresses a quiet fear that may have been sitting underneath everything we've discussed. The worry that testing the gate is a one-way, irreversible decision, that once you step through it, the comfortable courtyard behind you disappears entirely, leaving you stranded in unfamiliar territory, with no way back if the attempt doesn't go well. I want to correct this gently, because it isn't true, and believing it tends to make the gate feel far more frightening than it actually needs to. The gate you're standing at tonight is not a one-time, irreversible threshold. It is closer to a door you can open part way, step through cautiously, and close again behind you, if the season calls for it, without any of that back and forth counting against you as failure or inconsistency. Marcus Aurelius did not permanently abandon comfort, structure, or safety in pursuit of growth. He returned, again and again, to the stable rhythms of his daily responsibilities, his ongoing relationships, the steady architecture of an examined life that continued alongside its gradual unfolding. Growth, understood this way, is not a permanent departure from your citadel. It is an ongoing, lifelong relationship between the courtyard and the field beyond it, walking out when a season calls for it, returning to rest when a season calls for that instead. Neither movement representing a final, unchangeable verdict on who you are. This matters enormously for how bravely you're able to approach your own gate. If testing it felt like burning every bridge back to safety, hesitation would be the only sane response. But it isn't that. You are allowed to try and to retreat if the attempt doesn't go as hoped, and to try again later, differently, with what you learned from the retreat folded gently into the next attempt. This is not inconsistency. It is in fact exactly how growth actually tends to unfold in a real, honest life, not as a single, dramatic, irreversible leap, but as a long, ongoing conversation between courage and rest, tested and revised, again and again, for as long as living continues to ask it of you. Rest here with me a moment longer. Picture a path leading both away from the citadel and back toward it. The same path, walked in either direction, depending entirely on what the season calls for. Notice that this path does not disappear the moment you walk away from the walls. It remains patient, always available, exactly as capable of leading you home again as it is of leading you outward. Let this image settle something in you. Whatever step you take, tonight or in the days ahead, the path back remains open. You are not choosing, in any single moment, between permanent shelter and permanent exposure. You are simply choosing which direction today's honest walking calls for, trusting that the path itself will still be there, waiting patiently whenever you need to walk it the other way. Breathe here a few moments longer. When you're ready, we'll move toward the final close of our time together. I want to offer one last, small, practical piece before we gather everything together, because I think it addresses the gap between understanding tonight's ideas and actually, honestly living them. The particular power of a beginning, small enough that resistance barely has the chance to organize itself against it. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself about the difficulty of rising each morning to face the demands of his day, offered himself a strikingly simple reminder that he was made for this, made to act, made to engage with the work in front of him, however unglamorous that work might feel in the particular groggy discomfort of a cold morning. He did not wait for inspiration or full readiness before beginning. He simply began, in whatever small, immediate way was actually available to him in that exact moment. I want to offer you the same permission, translated into something concrete, you can use this week. Whatever gate you've been standing in front of, the honest conversation, the creative attempt, the small act of testing, whether the walls around a particular part of your life are actually load-bearing. I want to invite you not to commit to the entire field beyond it all at once. I want to invite you instead to commit only to the first 10 minutes. 10 minutes of drafting the difficult message without needing to send it yet. 10 minutes of sitting with the uncertain creative work without needing to finish it or share it with anyone. 10 minutes of simply standing at the gate, hand on the latch, without needing to walk through it entirely. This is not a lesser, watered-down version of growth. It is, in fact, one of the most reliable ways growth actually happens in a real life, because the resistance that keeps a gate sealed shut is almost always proportional to the size of the commitment being imagined. Shrink the commitment down to 10 honest minutes, and the resistance very often shrinks right alongside it, small enough, finally, to actually walk past. You do not need the whole field figured out tonight. You need only the first 10 minutes, offered, honestly, as many times as it takes, for as long as this particular growth continues to ask it of you. I want to offer one more reflection before we close, because I think it corrects a picture that may have quietly formed across this hour without either of us fully intending it. The picture of growth as a series of dramatic, singular moments of courage, rather than what it actually tends to be in an honest life. Marcus Aurelius did not write his private journal once in a single burst of clarity that resolved everything permanently. He wrote it night after night, year after year, often repeating the same reminders to himself in slightly different words, because the pull back toward comfort, toward forgetting, toward the easier path of not examining his own conduct honestly, returned constantly, regardless of how many times he'd already faced it down before. His courage was not a single heroic act. It was thousands of small, unremarkable acts of continuing to show up honestly, night after night, in a private journal no one else was ever meant to read. This matters enormously for how you carry tonight forward. You do not need a single, dramatic moment of transformation in order for this conversation to have mattered. You need, instead, something far more ordinary and far more achievable: the willingness to keep returning to your own honest attention, again and again, in exactly the unglamorous, repetitive way Marcus modeled across the pages of his own private writing. Some nights that attention will feel clear and energized. Other nights, it will feel like dragging yourself, reluctantly, back to a question you'd rather avoid. Both are part of the same ordinary courage. Not the courage of a single decisive leap, but the quieter, more sustainable courage of simply continuing to show up, honestly, for as many nights as it takes. There is one more layer to this work I want to name before we close, because it often goes unspoken in conversations about growth, and I think its absence leaves people unprepared for something real that tends to arrive alongside even the most genuinely positive change: grief for the self being left behind. Even growth you actively want, growth that clearly serves you, growth you'd choose again without hesitation if given the choice, often carries a quiet mourning alongside it. The familiar identity you're stepping beyond, however limiting it may have become, was still yours. It still held a particular comfort, a particular predictability, a particular way of being known by the people around you that a new, less settled version of yourself has not yet had the chance to earn. It is entirely normal, even in the midst of genuinely positive change, to find yourself missing the simplicity of who you used to be, even while remaining clear that who you used to be no longer fits the life you're actually trying to live. Marcus Aurelius, in becoming the person capable of writing meditations, necessarily left behind a younger, less examined version of himself, the boy who once simply enjoyed philosophy as an intellectual interest, before it became the demanding, daily practice that carried him through plague, war, and the loss of his own children. I don't know whether he grieved that earlier, less burdened version of himself in any way the historical record preserves, but I would be surprised if he didn't, at least in some private, unrecorded moment. Growth of any real substance tends to ask something of us in this way, not because it's taking something away maliciously, but because becoming more fully yourself necessarily means becoming less entirely identical to who you were before. If you notice this grief arriving alongside your own growth in the weeks ahead, I want you to receive it as a normal, even healthy sign that something real is actually shifting, rather than as evidence that the growth itself was somehow a mistake. You are allowed to miss your old courtyard, even while walking, gladly, through the gate. Both things can be true, simultaneously, held together, with the same gentle, undivided attention we've practiced throughout this entire evening. Rest here with me, once more before the final stretch of tonight's conversation. Picture the particular quality of light that gathers right at a threshold, neither fully inside nor fully outside. The pale, mingled light of a doorway, standing open on a mild evening, indoor warmth and outdoor air, meeting in the same narrow space, without either one needing to win. You are allowed to rest in this threshold light for as long as you need tonight. You do not have to fully commit to the courtyard or fully commit to the field beyond it in this exact moment. You can simply stand here in this mingled doorway light, feeling both temperatures at once, unhurried, undecided, entirely permitted to remain exactly here for a while longer. Breathe in this threshold light. Notice how little it demands of you. No verdict, no direction, just the simple, honest fact of standing somewhere real, between two things that are both, in their own way, still yours. When you're ready, we'll move toward the final close of our evening together. I want to offer one last image before we gather everything together, because I think it captures something essential about the particular shape tonight's growth is likely to take in your own life. Not sudden, not dramatic, but patient, seasonal, and entirely trustworthy in its own quiet timing. Think of a vineyard in the depths of winter, its vines cut back hard, seemingly reduced to almost nothing, compared to the lush, fruit-heavy growth of late summer. A person unfamiliar with vineyards might look at this winter pruning and conclude that something has gone terribly wrong, that the vines have been damaged, diminished, stripped of everything that once made them worth tending. But anyone who has actually kept a vineyard knows the truth is precisely the opposite. That hard winter pruning is not damage. It is the exact condition that makes the following year's growth possible at all. A vine, left unpruned, allowed to sprawl endlessly in whatever direction it happens to grow, produces more leaves and less fruit, more sprawling comfort, and less of the concentrated, worthwhile substance the vineyard actually exists to produce. I want to offer you this image as a final, gentle encouragement regarding whatever pruning your own growth might currently be asking of you. The comfortable habits set aside, the familiar identity trimmed back, the sprawling, easy version of your days, made smaller and more deliberate in service of something that will, in its own season, produce far more than the unpruned version ever could have managed on its own. This pruning is not punishment. It is not evidence that something has gone wrong with your life. It is, exactly like the vineyard's winter cutting, the precise necessary condition for whatever fuller growth is still ahead of you, arriving in its own patient time, exactly as it's always meant to. I want to return, in these final moments before we close, to the very word this evening's title placed at its center: warning. I chose to sit with this word carefully at the start of tonight's conversation, and I want to return to it now, at the end, because I think the difference between a warning and a threat is exactly the difference between everything we've built together tonight and the harsher, more punishing conversation this could have become instead. A threat operates through fear alone, and it tends to demand immediate, anxious compliance. Change now, or suffer the consequences, with no patience for context, no room for your particular season, no interest in whether you're actually ready. A warning is different. A warning comes from care. It says, simply and honestly, here is something worth knowing, offered because I want good things for you, offered with enough respect for your own judgment to trust you with the information, rather than forcing your hand through fear. This is the spirit in which Marcus Aurelius wrote his own private warnings to himself, and it's the spirit in which I've tried to offer his warning to you tonight. He was not trying to frighten himself into compliance. He was trying, gently, repeatedly, across years of private pages, to remind himself of something he knew to be true, and kept, understandably, forgetting under the weight of his daily demands, that a life spent entirely inside comfortable walls, however genuinely earned that comfort might be, eventually stops being a life fully lived and starts becoming something closer to a beautifully appointed waiting room. I want you to receive tonight's warning in exactly this spirit, as information offered with care, not as a threat, demanding immediate, anxious action. You are free to sit with what we've discussed for as long as you need. You are free to test your own gait on whatever timeline actually fits your particular season, without treating any delay as evidence of failure. The warning has done its work simply by being heard, honestly, without flinching away from it, and without being frightened into rash, ill-considered action by it either. What happens next belongs entirely to you, at whatever pace your own honest unfolding actually calls for. I want to close the teaching portion of tonight's conversation with a reflection on something easy to forget in a practice this private, this internal, this focused on your own individual gait and your own individual citadel. You are not actually walking this particular road alone, even though so much of tonight's language has, understandably, centered on your own singular, private, inner life. Every person who has ever genuinely wrestled with the pull between comfort and growth, and this includes, I suspect, nearly every person who has ever lived long enough to notice the tension at all, has stood exactly where you're standing right now, at their own version of this exact threshold. Marcus Aurelius stood there in a cold military tent, missing the quiet philosophical life he'd once imagined for himself. Epictetus stood there in circumstances of genuine, involuntary confinement that make our modern comforts look almost absurd by comparison, and found, even there, an internal gate worth testing. Countless people, across every era this species has managed to survive, have stood at their own citadel wall, feeling the same particular mixture of fear and quiet longing you may be feeling right now. This does not make your own particular gate any less yours, any less specific to the particular shape of your own life and history. But I hope it offers some quiet comfort, the way it's always offered comfort to me, to know that the tension itself is not a personal defect, not evidence that something has gone uniquely wrong with your own character. It is, instead, one of the oldest, most universal tensions a thinking creature can experience. The pull between the safety of what's already known and the uncertain promise of what hasn't yet been tested. And every single person who has ever chosen, honestly and imperfectly, to test their own gate anyway, belongs to the same quiet, ancient company you're joining tonight, simply by having sat with this conversation for as long as you have. One more pause before we walk toward the very last part of tonight's conversation. Picture a small fire, built carefully at the edge of a field. Just as evening settles in, its light reaching only a modest distance into the surrounding dark, its warmth enough for exactly the small circle of people or thoughts gathered near it. No more, no less. Notice that this fire does not need to illuminate the entire field in order to be worth building. It simply needs to hold its small, steady circle of warmth for as long as the evening requires. Let yourself sit inside that circle for a few breaths, whatever remains unresolved about your own gate. And something likely does remain unresolved, because this work was never meant to conclude neatly by the end of a single evening. Let it stay unresolved for now, resting just outside the fire's light, patient, unbothered, entirely permitted to wait until you're ready to look at it directly again. Breathe here a few moments longer, feeling the fire's modest, sufficient warmth. When you're ready, we'll walk the final short distance toward the close of tonight's conversation. I want to offer one final, concrete reflection before we move into the closing invitation, because I think it grounds everything we've discussed in something you can actually carry into tomorrow morning, rather than leaving it floating in the realm of abstract philosophy alone. Think about the actual, specific shape of a single day, lived with even a little more honesty than the day before it. One small conversation approached truthfully, instead of avoided. One modest creative effort attempted, instead of postponed. One moment of genuine rest, chosen consciously, instead of collapsed into out of sheer depletion. This single day, examined closely, rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It does not announce itself as a turning point. It simply passes, ordinary in every visible way, and yet something real has shifted within it. A small, honest deposit made into the kind of life you're actually trying to build, rather than the kind of life that simply happens to you while you wait, indefinitely, for some larger, more decisive moment to arrive and do the work on your behalf. Marcus Aurelius understood, with a clarity that took him years of private, repeated practice to fully internalize, that these small, honest days are not lesser versions of a well-lived life, waiting to be redeemed by some future, more significant accomplishment. They are the entire substance of a well-lived life, stacked one atop another, each one complete and sufficient in itself, regardless of whether any external observer ever notices the quiet, cumulative pattern they're slowly forming. I want to invite you, as we move toward the close of tonight, to consider tomorrow, not as the day you'll finally begin some grand, sweeping transformation, but simply as one more honest day, offered the same modest, achievable attention as this evening's conversation. has tried to offer you. One small step toward the gate, if the day calls for it. One conscious choice of genuine rest, if that's what the day actually needs instead. Either way, met honestly, is enough. It has always been enough. That is, perhaps, the quietest and most important part of Marcus Aurelius's entire warning. Not that you must transform everything at once, but that the entire transformation was always going to happen exactly this way, regardless. One honest, ordinary day at a time, for as many days as you're given to practice it. I want to close the teaching portion of tonight with one last, quiet reflection on something Marcus Aurelius himself never had the chance to know, how his own private words would eventually be received by people living nearly 2,000 years after his death, in circumstances he could not possibly have imagined, wrestling with versions of comfort and complacency shaped by forces, screens, algorithms, an entire globalized economy of convenience that would have seemed to him closer to magic than to any recognizable feature of daily life. He wrote those pages believing, as far as we can tell, that no one would ever read them at all. He was writing for an audience of exactly one, himself, on a particular difficult night, needing a particular difficult reminder. And yet, here we are, nearly 2 millennia later, still finding in his private, unpolished, repetitive reminders to himself something that continues to matter, something that continues to offer real, lived guidance to people facing struggles, whose outer shape he never could have predicted, but whose inner shape, the pull toward comfort, the fear of an uncertain gate, the quiet, ongoing work of choosing growth over stagnation, day after ordinary day, has apparently remained recognizably, consistently human across every single one of those 2,000 years. I find something deeply moving in this. It suggests that the private, unwitnessed work you do on your own inner life, however small, however invisible to anyone currently around you, carries a kind of quiet permanence that external achievement rarely matches. Marcus never built a monument he expected to last. He simply wrote, honestly to himself, night after night, about the ordinary difficulty of trying to live well. And that ordinary honesty, offered to no audience at all, turned out to be exactly the kind of thing capable of reaching across nearly 2,000 years, to sit with you, tonight, in whatever room currently holds you. Your own honest attention tonight, however private, however unwitnessed by anyone beyond yourself, may carry a similar kind of quiet permanence, not because anyone will read about it 2,000 years from now, but because the person you become through this kind of patient, repeated honesty carries forward into every day that follows, shaping choices and conversations and quiet moments of courage in ways that ripple forward far longer and far further than you'll ever be able to fully trace. I want to end with the same kind of reminder Marcus so often gave himself at the close of a difficult page. Not a grand conclusion, not a dramatic final argument, but a simple, plain restatement of what actually matters, offered gently, one more time before we part. You are allowed to rest. Your citadel was built for good reasons, and it has served you faithfully. You are also allowed to grow, not because staying still makes you unworthy, but because some quiet, honest part of you has been standing at a particular gate for a while now, wondering, patiently, whether this might finally be the season to test it. Both of these things are true at once, and neither one cancels out the other. This was never a choice between comfort and growth, offered as opposites locked in permanent conflict. It was always an invitation to hold both honestly, resting, when rest is what alignment calls for, testing the gate, when testing is what alignment calls for instead. Trusting your own honest, patient discernment to tell the difference, one ordinary day at a time, for as long as this particular life continues to ask it of you. One more pause before the final close. Picture dust settling slowly in a shaft of late afternoon light, each small particle drifting downward at its own unhurried pace. None of them racing to reach the floor first, none of them behind schedule for having taken their time. There is something quietly beautiful in watching this, if you've ever paused long enough to actually notice it. The sense that even something this small, this seemingly insignificant, moves according to its own patient, physical law, entirely unconcerned with hurry. Let your own thoughts settle the same way for these last few breaths. Whatever stirred in you tonight, a memory, a fear, a small flicker of hope about a gate you might finally be ready to test. Let it drift downward at its own pace, unhurried, uncounted, entirely permitted to land wherever and whenever it actually needs to. Breathe here a few moments longer, in and out. There's nowhere else you need to be right now than exactly here, watching this last, gentle, unhurried settling before we close. I want to offer one final practical thought before we move into the closing invitation, a way of carrying tonight's central practice forward that doesn't require you to remember every image, every historical detail, every distinction we've drawn across this long conversation. If you remember nothing else from tonight, I want you to remember this. You can climb your own watchtower at any moment, in any ordinary setting, simply by pausing and asking one honest question. Not a complicated question, not one requiring philosophical training to answer well. Simply this: am I resting right now because rest is genuinely what this moment calls for? Or am I resting because testing the gate feels harder than staying still? This single question, asked honestly and without harsh self-judgment, does most of the work this entire evening has been trying to offer you. It doesn't demand an answer that favors growth every time. Sometimes, the honest answer really will be that rest is exactly right for this particular moment, and that answer deserves to be trusted completely, without guilt, without second guessing, but asked consistently, gently, across enough ordinary moments. This question keeps you from the one thing tonight's warning was actually trying to protect you from: not comfort itself, never comfort itself, but comfort chosen unconsciously, by default, without ever actually being asked the honest question at all. Carry this question with you, the way you'd carry a small stone in your pocket, not something you need to think about constantly, just something available, within reach, whenever a moment calls for it. That's the entire watchtower, portable now, carried forward into whatever ordinary Tuesday or difficult Thursday happens to need it next. I want to address one last, commonest experience before we close, because I suspect it may already be stirring in some of you, even after everything we've discussed tonight about patience, about seasons, about the long, unhurried timing of genuine growth. Impatience with yourself for not already being further along. This impatience is understandable, and I don't want to simply talk you out of it as though it were purely irrational. It often comes from a real, honest place, a genuine desire to live more fully, more honestly, more aligned with what actually matters to you, arriving alongside a frustration that this desire hasn't yet translated into visible change. I want to honor that desire, even while gently questioning the impatience wrapped around it. Here is what I want to offer instead. Impatience, examined closely, often carries a hidden assumption worth naming directly: that growth, properly done, should move faster than it actually does, and that its current pace is therefore evidence of some personal failing rather than simply the honest, unglamorous timing that real growth has always required in every single life that has ever genuinely undergone it. Marcus Aurelius, writing the same reminders to himself across years of private pages, does not read like a man who found this work quick or easy. He read like a man who needed to hear the same truths repeatedly, patiently, because understanding something intellectually and actually living it consistently are two very different accomplishments, separated by exactly the kind of slow, repetitive practice this entire evening has tried to model for you. If impatience arrives in the days ahead, I want you to meet it the same way we've met everything else tonight, with the gate practice gently applied to itself. Feel the impatience honestly in the body before rushing past it. Name it plainly. This is impatience, not evidence of failure. Breathe once to stay present with it, rather than either indulging it into harsh self-criticism or suppressing it into false calm, and choose, consciously, to extend yourself the same patient grace you would offer anyone else honestly wrestling with a difficult, worthwhile, unglamorous practice, because that is in fact exactly what you are doing, and it deserves exactly that much respect. One more pause before the final stretch of tonight's conversation. Picture your own two hands cupped together in front of you, as though holding a small amount of water drawn from a still pool. Notice how little effort this requires. No grasping, no tight-fisted clutching, just the simple, open shape of hands willing to hold something gently, without needing to squeeze it into staying. Let this be a picture of how you hold everything we've discussed tonight, not gripped tightly, not clutched out of anxious determination to make it stick, but held the way water is held in open, cupped hands, present, real, cared for, and also, gently, allowed to be exactly as much or as little as naturally remains once you stand back up and continue on with your evening. Breathe here a few moments longer, feeling the openness of your own hands, whether they're actually cupped right now or simply imagined that way. There is nothing to grip tightly tonight, only something to hold, gently, for as long as it wants to stay. When you're ready, we'll walk the last short distance toward the close of our time together. I want to offer one final image before we move into the closing invitation, because I think it captures something true about the particular position most of us occupy most of the time, not fully sealed inside the citadel and not fully committed to the field beyond it, but standing, more often than either extreme, in a quiet, ordinary middle ground that rarely gets named directly. Picture two rivers running roughly parallel to each other, separated by a strip of solid ground, wide enough to walk along comfortably. One river represents the pull toward comfort, familiar, warm, well-worn, exactly as inviting as we've discussed all evening. The other represents the pull toward growth, colder, less certain, but carrying its own particular vitality, its own promise of somewhere genuinely new. Most of us do not live entirely in one river or the other. We walk, most days, along the strip of ground between them, occasionally dipping a hand into one, occasionally wading briefly into the other, rarely fully submerged in either for very long. I want to offer you permission, in these final moments, to simply be a person walking this middle ground, rather than someone who has either fully mastered growth or fully surrendered to comfort. This middle path is not a failure to commit. It is, in fact, the actual, honest shape, most real, sustainable growth takes across an entire lifetime. Not a single dramatic plunge into the cold river of change, followed by permanent transformation, but this ongoing, patient walking, alongside both rivers, dipping into growth when a season calls for it, returning to the warmth of comfort when rest is genuinely what's needed, trusting your own honest discernment to guide each small choice, rather than demanding of yourself some final, permanent resolution between the two. This is, I think, the truest and gentlest way to carry Marcus Aurelius's warning forward, not as a demand to abandon one river for the other entirely, but as an invitation to keep walking honestly along the ground between them, testing each water when it's genuinely time, resting on solid ground when rest is genuinely what the day requires. For as long as this particular life continues, patiently, to ask that ongoing, unhurried walking of you. We are near the end of our time together now, and I want to close the way this space always closes, not with a demand, not with a checklist of homework to complete before we meet again, but with an invitation offered freely to whatever pace feels true to you. If any part of tonight settled something in you, the image of the citadel, the permission to distinguish real rest from quiet stagnation, the 4 soft movements of the gate practice, the story of the gardener and her orchard beyond the hill, I want you to know that you don't have to do anything further with it right now. You don't need to have a plan for tomorrow. You have already done the part that matters most. You showed up, you landed in your body, and you let yourself consider for 1 full hour that the walls you've built are not evidence of failure, but old, patient companions worth examining honestly, rather than either tearing down all at once or leaving forever, unquestioned. This is what I mean by soft duty, the phrase we've returned to throughout tonight, not the harsh, achievement-based duty our culture usually demands, the kind that measures your worth by how quickly you transform, how visibly you grow, how impressively you can prove your own development to an audience. Soft duty asks something smaller, and in some ways, something much harder, to master precisely because it offers no dramatic proof of progress. The duty simply to keep standing honestly at your own gate, again and again, without needing each visit to yield an immediate, measurable result. If you found something here that felt like a safe container tonight, a place where you could examine your own comfort, honestly, without being shamed for it, without being handed another program to optimize, without being told your careful, protective walls were simply a problem requiring correction, I want to invite you to return here if it serves you. We meet in this clearing regularly, not because you need to prove your commitment through consistent attendance, but because some kinds of gates only open gradually, through repeated, unhurried practice, the way a rusted hinge only loosens slowly, over many gentle attempts, never all at once from a single afternoon of force. If you'd like to be here for that next gathering, subscribing is simply a way of keeping the path back to this particular watchtower a little easier to find. It costs you nothing, and it asks nothing further of you than your presence whenever you're ready to offer it again. You would be joining a quiet company of people doing exactly what you did tonight, standing honestly at their own gate, one evening at a time, without rushing towards some imagined finish line, without needing to announce their growth to anyone, simply choosing again and again the slow, patient work of testing the field beyond their walls, rather than either abandoning the walls entirely or forgetting forever that a gate was ever there at all. There is no pressure in this invitation. You are welcome here exactly as you are, exactly as often as you choose to return, and exactly as infrequently as your life allows, without a single moment of that absence requiring justification. For now, let this hour close the way all good evenings close. not with a demand for what comes next, but with permission simply to rest. Let the night do its quiet underground work, the same patient work we spoke of in the vineyard, in the roots beneath the surface, in the seed that shows nothing above ground, for weeks before anything visible finally appears. You do not need to check on your own growth constantly to know that it's happening. You do not need to dig it up to confirm it hasn't failed. You have done enough tonight. You landed in your body. You looked, honestly, toward a citadel you may have spent years assuming was simply the whole of your world. You let yourself imagine that the gate was never actually locked from the outside, and that whatever waits beyond it is not a threat to be feared indefinitely, but a field, patient and unhurried, willing to be walked whenever you're finally ready. Rest now. The lantern on the wall stays lit, even after you close your eyes. It does not need your constant attention to keep burning through the night. That, too, is a kind of grace. One more quiet proof that some of the most important growth in a life happens not through anxious effort, but through trust, offered patiently to a process far wiser and far more faithful than our impatience ever gives it credit for being. Until we meet again in this clearing, take good care of the whole of your own life, the comfortable rooms you've rightly earned and still deserve to rest in, and the field beyond the wall, still waiting quietly, patiently, for whichever season you're finally ready to walk into it. Good night. If you're still here, still listening, still resting in this quiet clearing we've built together tonight, I want to leave you with one last, small thought, separate from everything else we've discussed, because I think it deserves its own space, rather than being folded into the closing that came before it. Somewhere in the last hour, you gave something rare to yourself, unhurried attention, turned honestly toward a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding, not because they're incapable of facing it, but because so little of daily life ever actually slows down enough to make the asking possible in a world that constantly asks you to justify your time by what it produces. This hour produced nothing measurable at all. No gate was necessarily opened. No dramatic transformation occurred. And yet I would offer, gently, that very little you did this week mattered more than this. Marcus Aurelius never knew, writing alone in that cold military tent, whether anyone would ever read his private words. He wrote them anyway, not for an audience, not for a legacy, but simply because the practice itself, the honest, repeated, unglamorous practice of examining his own life clearly, mattered enough, on its own terms, to be worth the effort regardless of whoever witnessed it. I want to offer you that same permission tonight. Whatever shifted in you across this hour, however small, however invisible to anyone else, was worth the hour spent on it, entirely on its own terms, regardless of what visible growth does or doesn't follow from here. If you found this hour valuable and you'd like to sit in this clearing again, not out of obligation, not because you owe this space your continued attention, but simply because it served you, subscribing is a quiet way of keeping the path back here easy to find. There is no pressure attached to that choice. Come back when it serves you. Stay away when your life asks for something different. Both choices are honored equally here, and wherever you go from this moment, back into the ordinary noise of your evening, into sleep, into whatever tomorrow happens to hold, I want you to carry one small thing with you, smaller than a lesson, closer to a permission. You do not have to keep every wall exactly as high as you built it out of habit alone. You can, whenever you're ready, in whatever season that readiness finally arrives, walk to your own gate and simply look. You can offer yourself honesty. You can offer yourself a lantern held steady on the wall for as long as it takes, And you can trust, the way a vineyard trusts a hard winter pruning, that whatever grows from that honesty will grow exactly as it needs to. Not on your schedule, not on anyone else's, but on the patient, faithful timing of a season that has never once, in the entire history of living things, failed to eventually turn. Rest well, the gate will still be there tomorrow. And so, quietly, steadily, patiently will I. Good night.